Environmental Quality Commission. And there's our reminder that this meeting is being recorded. And as we go along, like I said, Stephanie will be adding people as appropriate to the meeting, and we will just roll with all the realities of electronic meetings today. Okay, so for the record, let's show that all commissioners are present electronically at this time. And I want to thank all the staff and all the citizens of Oregon who have chosen to join us today as we work on some very important matters for the state of Oregon and for our environment. And with that in mind, we would like to start our meeting today with a brief video that was recently produced by DEQ that we think is worth sharing. So we're going to give that a shot.
And this is Stephanie Caldera, the EQC assistant. I'm going to transition over to a different web page, and it'll be just one moment. And then we should have this video, which is on the DEQ YouTube page, available for people to watch, playing in just a moment.
And this video is only a couple minutes long, so it's not going to be terribly long, but I think it'll be a nice introduction to our meeting. Thank you, Stephanie.
At the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, we have one mission: to be a leader in restoring, maintaining, and enhancing the quality of Oregon's air, land, and water. That's no small job.
Wildfire smoke is one of the biggest air pollutants that we have to be worried about in Oregon, though it's really important to monitor wildfires when they break out. So we work with state and federal agencies to produce our own advisories that we issue to the public so that they can take measures to protect their health. DEQ also regulates and monitors air pollution from cars, factories, and other industrial processes to ensure environmental health for the public.
Here at DEQ, my job is to clean up and restore lands so that they can be safely reused. So at this site, and at many other sites across the state, we're creating new economic opportunities for the community, and we're also creating important wetland habitat for a variety of fish and wildlife species.
Collects water quality samples in order to learn the status and trends of the water quality in our waterways. Oregon has some of the most amazing water bodies in the world, so it's important to keep them safe and healthy for fish and for drinking water, and just for the pure enjoyment of our cold, cool streams.
Oregon has some of the most beautiful places in the world. We owe it to our children and our children's children to protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, and this great land we call home.
Oregon. There's a lot to protect.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for helping us view that today. I think it's a great way to start our meeting. And I want to thank all the folks who participated in the production of that video. You know, for those of us who are working with the Department of Environmental Quality all the time, we can sometimes assume that, you know, these things are known, why it is that the agencies do the things they do. But I think a succinct piece like that can help people out who don't know so much about the department or why it does what it does. So appreciate that. Okay, as we begin today, we have been provided the agenda in advance. Commissioners have had an opportunity to review the agenda. We always reserve the right to maybe adjust the agenda as we need as we move through the day. But Director, Commissioners, do we need any amendments to the agenda at this time?
No changes here, Chair George.
Hearing none, we will proceed with our agenda as presented. Very good. All right, so let's get underway with our first action item of the day. All the commissioners have been provided the draft meeting minutes in advance, and we've had a few here. So we've had the opportunity to review those. Do we see the need for any amendments or changes to the meeting minutes as they have been presented? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes as provided.
This is Commissioner Kyle. I move we approve the meeting minutes as presented.
I'll second that.
Motion's been made and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Do we have any opposition? Meeting minutes are approved. Thank you very much. All right, our first informational item of the day is the update on DEQ's 2019-21 budget and operations. And so we'll turn the floor over to Brian Bowling and Leah Feldon. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, commissioners. For the record, my name is Leah Feldon. I serve as the Deputy Director for DEQ. And with me today to present this item to you is Brian Bowling, our Central Services Division Administrator. So this is a very brief agenda item, just intended to give you an update on the operational and budget shifts that have occurred as a result of the COVID pandemic. And with the situation changing almost daily and the need for quick shifts in our operations, we have needed to be nimble and structured in how we provide direction to staff and maintain the operations at DEQ. So to start us off, Brian is going to tell you a little bit about that management through the incident command structure.
Thank you, commissioners. For the record, my name is Brian Bowling. I'm the Central Services Division Administrator. During this pandemic, the agency really took to heart to make sure that our #1 priority is the safety of our staff. In order to make sure that that occurs, we immediately, when the pandemic started, developed a pandemic team that got to work dealing with the situation. Early on, we saw the importance of that team and actually getting a little bit more structure behind what we did. So we stepped in to develop an incident command structure behind the work that we did. This is a formal way of operating in a crisis, and something that we took an opportunity not only to deal with this particular crisis that we were after, but also just getting more experience with working within a structure of that way. So we developed and kind of teamed out. I'm the incident commander for the ICS structure. And then we had a couple teams around logistics, around operations, finance, that started working together. And we developed what's called an IAP, or an incident action plan, on a weekly basis on what we were doing, what we were trying to tackle for that week, what goals we needed to meet, and working through those as teams, making sure that we handed off work to a subgroup to work on, and then bringing it back to the team to keep everybody informed. And at the end of the week, giving a debrief on what has occurred, and then what is that action plan for the next week. And we've since transitioned to every 2 weeks generating an action plan. And through that, we've been very successful in moving our agency through our COVID situation, both from an externally facing, bringing in questions around how the agency was handling certain situations, and internally developing safety plans in a couple of different areas of our agency, a general safety plan, a reopening plan for our agency, including a safety plan for reopening VIP. All that through countless efforts of our planning team that put the documents together, looking at various guidances that are out there through WHO, through CDC, through DAS, Administrative Services for Oregon. And one thing that everybody's experiencing is those guidance changing a lot. Every week those guidance is changing, and keeping up on those, and ultimately communicating out to our staff on what they need to do to keep themselves safe, what work we're doing, not doing, and making sure that everybody understands kind of the direction that we're taking the agency during this pandemic. So one of the teams that we did establish was the operations team, and they had kind of the oversight of what that work is that we're going to take on and continue to do versus work that we're going to be shutting down. And so during this time, I hand this back over to Leah to talk a little bit about operations and what was going on with operations.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I'm going to cover some operational aspects that have shifted at DEQ. I think, as you've heard before, operations for those who conduct mostly in-office work have changed, but the staff have been extremely resilient and made the change to doing their work from home. For those who do come in the office, they will notice things like some new signage and requirements for following social distancing and mask face covering protocols. For those who conduct field work as a primary component of their jobs, they've experienced quite a bit more of a shift. As a result of the pandemic, we had to enact several restrictions to field work to ensure that any field work done needed to be conducted safely, and the determination that some field work could not be conducted safely at all right now. So specifically, some inspections that we suspended were for wastewater treatment plants, hospitals, crematoriums, correctional facilities, and any inspection of an on-site system or a pre-treatment system where there's a possibility of exposure to domestic waste. More generally speaking, the restrictions included field work where close contact with others couldn't be avoided, or if the inspection had to take place inside in tight quarters, and overnight travel. And staff and managers were also encouraged to consider for any inspection whether it could potentially be done virtually in certain circumstances, if it's a paperwork review or somebody could walk them around with a mobile device to show certain things that they needed to see. This could avoid the site visit altogether. And finally, an important component, of course, was the consideration of whether the facility was comfortable or ready to have DEQ on site. For enforcement, enforcement protocols have been adjusted to consider the dramatic disruptions to some facility operations, public health, and the economy. And we understand that some facilities may be facing staff shortages or service provider interruptions, or other pandemic-related disruptions to their ability to operate and finance their operations. So all of the applicable environmental laws still remain in effect, but DEQ has the discretion to exercise reasonable enforcement protocols during this time for violations that may be a result of changed operations at facilities during this period. And facilities are encouraged to document any pandemic-related disruptions to their operations when they report compliance issues, so that DEQ can consider the circumstances when determining any appropriate enforcement action. In the realm of new fieldwork protocols, I think, again, as the situation has unfolded and we all come to the realization that this is not a 1 month, a 2 month, a 3 month situation, we are now in a mode of figuring out, again, how we can conduct our work safely. So taking a new look at what are the protocols that we need in place to conduct field inspections, taking a renewed look at those that have been delayed or suspended, and making a new determination as to whether or not those should continue to be delayed or suspended, or whether it's possible now that we have more protocols and PPE in place that they could be conducted safely. The laboratory has started monitoring again at some critical monitoring sites, as noted in your staff report. A couple examples of those are beach monitoring and our wildfire smoke monitors. So they have created protocols for how they travel to those sites, what they do at the site, which are largely conducted with only DEQ staff. They're really never, unlike an inspection, there's no interaction with others like at a facility. And in the event that they have to do overnight travel, what are the protocols for overnight travel? So a couple of tools that have been developed through this process to help staff to look at these operations include the field work and inspection protocol. And again, that's basically a standard operating procedure, an SOP for the things that staff, sorry, my office light just went out, need to consider prior to conducting an inspection. So that includes, how they talk through potentially doing an inspection with the facility. It includes checking their own health before they go and having that conversation with their manager and making sure that they've got their PPE prepared to go and conduct that inspection. And then the other tool that staff are just starting to utilize and work with right now is what we call a priority and risk worksheet. And so this is to be used when they are looking at some of those specific categories that we suspended: wastewater treatment plants, hospitals, crematoriums, correctional facilities, and taking that look to say, is this a priority inspection that needs to be conducted now or in the next few months? And is it something that we can do safely with the PPE we have? And so as staff and managers work through these questions, we will start to determine which inspections continue to be delayed, which inspections can go forward with the protocols we have, and which ones may need to be conducted because of their priority, but we might determine we don't have the appropriate PPE to do it. And so that might raise new questions to what sort of PPE we might need. An example of this is in emergency response. Emergencies happen. DEQ is expected to be a first responder for certain of those emergencies. And so it's important that we make sure we have the right protective equipment for the staff if they find themselves in a situation where they can't socially distance.
Leah?
And then, yes, please.
So this is Kathleen. Just a couple of quick questions. Does DEQ at this time feel that it has sufficient PPE, whatever that is, for your people and for whatever needs that you have it? Do you have a sufficient stock of PPE?
Thank you, Chair George, for the question, because Brian is closer to this on a daily basis, if not on an hour-to-hour basis. I'm going to let him answer that question. He oversees the health and safety staff who order our supplies.
Thank you, Chair George, for the question. That has been a struggle early on, was being able to get enough PPE, and in particular, disinfectant. The supply chain for disinfectant was really hit hard, and that was a challenge, along with hand sanitizer. Working through the state response center, we've been able to get some of that through the state response center, but the supply chain has actually opened up too. What's been very helpful is actually not having staff in the offices. That has reduced the amount of usage of those to be able to actually maintain and make available those products throughout. And so at this point in time, the supply chain is getting more robust. We're able to have the PPE necessary. We're able to supply face masks, ample supply of hand sanitizer, disinfectant. We have now car kits that we supply that have cleaner within the car kit that they can wipe down the car. So that supply chain has really loosened up and allow us to do a lot better job making that available.
That's great, thank you. And either Brian or Leah, related question about what percentage of DEQ staff are working remotely primarily at this time?
So at this time we're running right around from a full-time and part-time in the higher 80% or so.
Okay.
A big part of where most of our office staff in our regional offices are either part-time, full-time, outside of our a reception staff that are still staffing the offices on a by appointment only and receiving mail. At our headquarters, the same situations there. Where we have most of the staff still in the offices are in VIP or vehicle inspection program, along with our laboratory. Those two locations are where we see the most of our people, and so we have additional things in place for their protection, including social distancing masks, to be able to do that. Some of our staff in our lab are able to work remotely, at least part-time, but those that are doing samples or going out in the field are still present in the laboratory.
Great, thank you.
That's a great transition. The last piece that I'm going to cover, Commission, is a little bit about VIP and how those operations have shifted. They've gone through probably the most change in terms of a roller coaster of any part of our agency. So for VIP, as you know, in March, DEQ suspended the VIP operations, and in other words, we closed the stations to ensure the safety for our staff and the customers. And then we have since reopened. The reopening occurred in mid to late June, depending on the county that the station was in. But I want to talk just briefly about several important steps that we employed in order to get to that reopening point. So first of all, as mentioned, we didn't open any stations until the county where that station is located had entered phase 1 for reopening under the governor's statewide reopening plan. But the phase 1 was one trigger, but not the only trigger. So we didn't open stations on day 1. The next piece was making sure that we had our plan in place for what that reopening needed to look like. So DEQ then prepared and trained all VIP staff on a reopening plan, which was created with guidance and consultation, I should say, with the CDC, the Oregon Health Authority, Oregon OSHA, and the staff and managers of the VIP program. And the plan includes a variety of mechanisms to keep staff and customers safe, including signage and new barriers, disinfection protocols, social distancing, face covering protocols, and the like. And I do just want to take a moment here. I think it's important to congratulate and acknowledge the VIP staff. They've weathered a lot of uncertainty around the station closures and reopening and timing for these things. And they've really embraced the new safety protocols in order to continue to provide great service and to keep themselves safe, importantly. So I'm just really proud of the staff's professionalism and ability to adapt in a way that promotes this safety for everyone. And I'm just about to transition back to Brian, who's going to talk to you a little bit about 2019 through 2021 biennium budget shifts and impacts from the pandemic. But just a final note on the VIP budget as we make that transition. The VIP budget, as I think we've discussed with you, has experienced an extreme shortfall due in part from the delays in getting the fee increase approved to maintain the current service level for VIP, and then compounded by the station closures. So with the Commission's adoption of the new fees in May, and then the reopening of the stations in June, we expect revenues to slowly come back, and we're going to be monitoring that budget closely to make sure that it's adequate. So unless you have any questions on that piece, I will hand it back to Brian to discuss the budget impacts.
Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, just a couple things. First, I want to commend DEQ management and staff keeping us out of the news. Quite frankly, they did an excellent job compared to the employment division, and a little bit even better than our friends at DEQ. The question I have, we had the private contract, I think you called it VIP 2. Did that pick up when our VIP stations were shut down?
Yes, great question, Commissioner Mosby. I actually should have mentioned that. So we did promote VIP 2 a bit more during this to try and make sure that people knew that there was an option for them. And we also employed a system so that folks could do an online certification registration process where they would still have to come back and actually get their car tested later. But this was a way that they could go ahead and get that certificate so that they could proceed with registration. I think that, in practice, the VIP 2 piece maybe picked up slightly, but that still entails somebody going to, say, a Jiffy Lube or something to get that service done. So for many folks, they just, I think, preferred to not do that at this time. I think the online registration piece was utilized as well to some degree. But I think for a lot of folks, they were just used to the stations. And so they were maybe happy to see those open again. But yes, we did have those options available, which I think was helpful. Okay, I'll hand it to Brian.
Thank you, Leah. So I'll talk a little bit about where we're at on the budget for 2019-21, the current biennia. The pandemic has had a budget impact in really two areas I'll talk about, and a third that we just don't know. And I'll start with the third that we just don't know. The other fund impact is still in question. We haven't seen that come through yet. We know that to be expecting something, but it's going to take a little time to see what depth that is. The only really other fund that we saw the impact is the VIP, which we just talked about. Where we saw a kind of an immediate impact was actually in lottery fund. In lottery fund, due to the closure of bars and video poker being the larger part of lottery fund, that had an immediate impact. And so the way that DEQ receives our funds in lottery, we get quarterly payments to us basically. And we expect to see a reduction immediately in our quarterly payments starting in the August payment. And for the biennia, we're looking at about a $900 to $1.4 million reduction in lottery funds. And this is based on the forecast that we get based on kind of where the bars are at in their opening, how much video sales are being seen. So we have planned for that reduction and immediately implemented things in our budget to be able to create that savings. We had vacancy savings along with supplies and service areas that we reduced to be able to immediately start saving that money. It didn't take any action by the governor or the legislature for us to experience that reduction. We just actually see less of a payment coming to us. So we've immediately had to start acting on those and have that in place. And we're closely monitoring the lottery situation moving forward. If there is further closing of bars, we will see additional reductions in that, and we'll act accordingly. On the general fund side, that's been a little bit different because we do not experience a reduction in revenue right away. That takes an action by the governor or the legislature. So what we have been asked of by Department of Administrative Services is an 8.5% reduction list. And we have supplied that reduction list to the department, and they have been working with the legislature on what that's going to look like for reductions to agencies by either an allotment reduction by the governor or a legislative action. At this point in time, we're looking at a short session towards the tail end of August, middle of August for taking this up. Main thing on the budget side is really understanding what the federal budget is going to do. Is there any more CARES Act money coming forward, or are there money coming to the state to kind of offset some of the impacts that the pandemic has had on the state's budget? With that information, and because at the federal level, they have to have that done by basically the first week of August. They go into recess. We will have that answer, and then legislature and governor's office will start to work on kind of the impacts for us. For our agency, what we have done is we've already identified that 8.5% list, most of that list being vacant positions, S&S, or supplies and services that we can kind of wait on. So we've already started to get savings from holding off filling those positions or making those purchases through S&S. So we've been already experiencing and getting those savings and are not waiting until we get an action by the governor or the legislature, and then we will move accordingly once we hear what a final reduction is going to look like for this biennia. In addition, we took one more step beyond that, and that is we put some administrative restrictions in at the agency, looking at around our recruitments, our DOJ costs, our purchasing, our contracts, just to be able to get a more insight into what those things are moving forward, and ability to quickly make adjustments as everything is kind of shifting very quickly for us. We wanted to give us an ample time to make those decisions and insight into that moving forward. So we've been actively monitoring the situation and making those decisions as quickly as we can, and making sure that we coop those savings as we move forward, so that we don't hit September, October, November and needing to make a large cut, because then it's much harder to make a large cut when there's only 9 months left in the biennia than if there's 14 months left in the biennia. And with that, I will open to questions.
Thank you, Brian and Leah. Yes, appreciate your overview of that. We know that these are really difficult times, but you're kind of walking us through the ways in which we're really being careful with our resources. Will, like you say, will help as the picture becomes clearer for the rest of the year and the out years. Commissioners, Director, do you have any other questions or comments on this presentation? I'm not seeing any at this time. So thank you. Yes, Director?
Yeah, just very briefly, because there's likely to be media on this tomorrow, the chairs of the Joint Ways and Means Committee for the state legislature, we understand are going to be releasing a framework for how to deal with the state budget and the current biennium later today. And so that will be a first step as we head toward a special session. It's not necessarily the final word, but I just didn't want commissioners to be surprised by that. We haven't seen it yet. We've heard a little bit about it, but again, don't be surprised if you see that, and just understand that it's really just an opening position in terms of what the legislature may do in August when we expect them to come into special session. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Director. That's good to be aware of. And I guess whenever we're talking about these sorts of challenging times, I guess I always want to just remember and thank the very, very hardworking staff at DEQ, who are doing the very best under very difficult circumstances, having to change their workplace, having to change how they do business, having to adapt and tighten belts. And I want to remember both all those hardworking people and the importance of the work that they do. And so we want to keep that in mind as well, as we know that as a state and as a department, we have some difficult days ahead. So thank you everyone for that. Do we have anything else on this agenda topic? All right, hearing none, thanks again, Leah and Brian. And we will now go to the update on water quality permitting programs.
Great, thank you, Chair George, members of the Commission, and Director Whitman. For the record, my name is Justin Green. I'm the administrator for DEQ's Water Quality Program. Also appearing with me today is Jeff Rabinowitz. He is the Water Quality Program's Permitting and Policy Development Manager. Today we are providing an update to the Commission on DEQ's Water Quality Permitting Program. The DEQ Water Quality Permitting Program is essential for the environmental health of Oregon's water. The program is technical in nature and critical to protect Oregon's rivers, lakes, streams, and groundwater for human health and the environment. Next slide, please. Today we'll provide an overview of the Water Quality Permitting Program, discuss the backlog of administratively extended permits, summarize recommendations received by third-party consultants and subsequent DEQ actions in response to those recommendations, discuss litigation and related settlements regarding the backlog, and provide an update on the results of permitting program improvements. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a brief overview of permit categories and types. As you all are likely aware, DEQ regulates the discharge of pollutants to Oregon's surface water and groundwater by issuing water quality permits. We issue National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, called Npds permits, for surface water discharges, rivers, lakes, streams, and Water Pollution Control Facility, or WPCF permits, to regulate potential groundwater discharges. DEQ operates the Npds permit program under delegated authority from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Oregon's Npds permit program must meet minimum requirements under the Clean Water Act and may not be less stringent than federal requirements. DEQ operates the WPCF permit, or groundwater program, largely under state authority. All the discharges to drinking water source areas must also meet federal requirements under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Under both the Npds and WPCF permit programs, DEQ issues two categories of permits: individual and general permits. An individual permit is a customized site-specific permit that accounts for wastewater discharges from individual wastewater treatment facilities at specific locations. Developing these permits is time and resource intensive, both for DEQ and for the discharging facility. A general permit is a permit assigned to a group of sources with a common discharge that can be regulated under similar types of conditions. After DEQ issues a general permit, individual dischargers that meet specific eligibility requirements are assigned coverage under that general permit. Issuing a general permit is also a time and resource intensive process. However, assigning individual coverage under a general permit generally requires less time than developing an individual permit. So DEQ issues both individual and general Mpds and WPCF permits. The most common types of dischargers within these categories include municipal wastewater discharges, that includes publicly owned sewage treatment facilities, and industrial wastewater dischargers from business and industries dominated by private businesses and industries. But it also includes some public facilities such as port authorities, universities, and prisons. Under the Federal Clean Water Act, the term of an Mpds permit is limited to 5 years, at which time the permit is to be renewed with the new permit requirements necessary to continually protect and improve water quality. If a permitted entity submits a timely permit application and DEQ fails to renew the permit before the permit expires, the permit is administratively continued. Under state requirements, the term of a WPCF permit is limited to 10 years, at which time the permit is renewed with updated permit requirements to protect groundwater. Much like the federal program, if a permit holder submits a timely application for a new permit, for renewal, and DEQ fails to timely reissue that permit, the permit is administratively extended. Next slide, please. So this pie chart provides a visual depiction of DEQ's Mpds permit types, the permits that we issue under the Clean Water Act provisions and regulate discharges to surface waters. DEQ has a large workload for individual domestic and industrial wastewater permits. Individual Mpds permits are generally classified into two categories: major discharges and minor dischargers. In general, major permits represent the largest point sources discharges with the higher flows across the state. For domestic wastewater sources, facilities that discharge 1 million gallons a day or more fall into the classification of a major facility. All other facilities are minor. The classification of industrial discharges into major and minor dischargers is more complex and also accounts for sources with a higher risk of pollution. So it's just showing the difference between the domestic and industrial wastewater discharges there. We currently regulate approximately 75 major individual Mpds permit holders, including discharges from 50 Mpds major domestic sources or sewage treatment facilities. These are the largest wastewater treatment facilities in the state. We regulate stormwater discharges from multiple jurisdictions around Oregon under municipal stormwater permits. These discharges represent a special category of discharge and regulation under the federal Mpds Municipal Separated Storm Sewer System program, otherwise referred to as the MS4 program. By looking at the chart, by far the largest number of Mpds discharges in Oregon are regulated under DEQ's general stormwater permits. We regulate the stormwater discharges from over 1,000 facilities under industrial stormwater general permits. In addition, we have over 1,400 construction sites that are regulated under our construction stormwater program, whereas the regulated number of facilities under most Mpds programs remain fairly stable over time. Stormwater construction permits typically vary both seasonally and with changes in state and local economies. It's reflective of construction activities going on in any given jurisdiction. And so we also regulate a large number of other Mpds discharges through general permits, including cooling water, fish hatcheries, suction dredge, mining operations, seafood processors, etc.
Justin, when those permits have had to be administratively extended, and you've certainly spoken before about our extensive backlog, what's the consequence to the effluent or the discharges of those going unevaluated and renewed for several years? My understanding is that it's often at the time of permit renewal that new pollution control technology or new technology that may not have been available or affordable in the previous permit is often negotiated and perhaps upgraded. So if we do have this extensive backlog of permits that haven't been reviewed and renewed, what's the consequence of that?
Chair George, thank you very much for that question. So it's an excellent question. Yeah, at renewal, we look at the entire facility. We reassess the discharges that the facility has. We look at receiving waters. We also look at any required changes in effluent limits for any given pollutant. So when a permit goes unreviewed for an extended period of time, we don't know, particularly if we don't have the ability to regulate any changes in the discharge that may be happening. We can't adjust the permit to reflect receiving waters. We're not able to update and make generally more stringent emission effluent limits for those facilities. So they regularly go. We still receive compliance reports and have the ability to work with the facility. But your point is very spot on, that if we don't have that timely renewal, we don't have that timely reassessment of the facility and reassessment of our environmental standards.
Well, and in the last 10 to 20 years, there's been some rather significant updates to some water quality criteria. I think, some to protect habitat, some to protect human health. And so if the criteria have changed since the previous permit was issued, would they be operating then under those less protective criteria?
That is accurate. In situations of a TMDL where the TMDL is in place, that may change. That's kind of somewhat of a different scenario. But for a facility, we have facilities. I'll actually provide some examples later in the meeting today, where we have facilities that don't have any mercury limits or requirements in their permits. And so as we're reissuing permits, we're incorporating the human health criteria based on fish consumption to provide for control of mercury in those permits.
Okay, thank you.
If I could,
Director.
Yeah, just real quickly, Justin did a good job of covering most of this, and but I want to just bring home two key things in terms of consequences of these permits being out of date. One is, Justin said, and as you indicated, standards change, but in Oregon in particular, in the area of toxics, we are going through an updating of our toxic standards to meet new human health fish consumption criteria. So there's a set of work around standards that are changing in order to meet human health around toxics, that if they're not incorporated into permits, we're not ultimately protecting public health. And then secondly, in areas of the state where we are not meeting our water quality standards for things like temperature or dissolved oxygen or sediment, there it's perhaps more of an environmental concern, but through our regular processes, we identify streams and rivers that are not meeting those standards and develop a plan for how to meet those standards. And it's the incorporation of those plans into permits through updated permits that really drives improvements in water quality in terms of impacts on the environment. So two pieces to think about: one, public health specifically, and the other really improvement in environmental conditions in line with what I think Oregonians expect to see in our rivers and streams.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's such focus on doing TMDL work and getting that work done. And it sounds like if that work may be done, but if the permits aren't renewed, all that work that was done for load allocations, that's not really going to be applied until the permit is updated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no more questions on that, next slide, please. And this is the profile of our WPCF or groundwater permits. We have individual domestic and industrial WPCF permits that account for about 12% of the total WPCF universe. A large number of the individual domestic WPCF permits are lagoon treatment systems that serve rural towns and cities. In the summer months, these sources typically land apply treated water to pastures and hayfields, thereby providing a valuable source of moisture and nutrients for local agriculture. The largest number of regulated discharges under DEQ's WPCF program are general industrial wastewater, individual domestic on-site permits. Typical discharges regulated under these permits include off-stream placer mining and wastewater from food processing operations such as wineries and fruit packing operations. We also have large on-site systems that are regulated under the WPCF program. They account for 42% of Oregon's what we call non-discharging permits. These on-site permits typically serve high volume discharges from commercial or institutional facilities or facilities that discharge high strength wastewater. Next slide, please. And so this slide just highlights the universe of work in the permitting program, and that work is extensive. The program issues and renews permits. We perform compliance inspections and review compliance reports, respond to complaints. The program also conducts and supports enforcement of compliance issues. We develop policy and guidance to be used across the state, engage with stakeholders, including permittees and non-governmental entities, and we provide technical assistance and outreach. So this kind of shows that it's not just it isn't just issuing a permit. We do a lot. There's a lot of work that is involved with issuing permits, performing compliance enforcement activities, etc. Next slide, please. So moving on to the water quality Mpds permit backlog. Coming out of the the international recession of the 2000s, by 2015, Oregon's Mpds permit backlog universe was greater than 80%. This led the legislature to direct DEQ in 2015 to hire an independent consultant to evaluate our Mpds permitting program and recommend solutions to address the backlog. And this culminated in 2016 with the NWH Mpds permitting program report. Next slide, please. So the report that we received from MWH made findings in several general topic areas. I'm going to go through each of these topic areas and discuss actions DEQ has taken to date in response. After discussing the MWH's findings, we will also provide an overview of an even more specific assessment that was provided by a consultant called PG Environmental, and the specific actions that they recommended that we take. So these are the initial findings from MWH back in 2016, and then we'll have a report that's a little bit more closer in time, a little bit more specific, with a consultant that worked really hand in hand with us, using our processes, using our systems to understand how our permitting process worked and where we could find improvements. So moving on to MWH's specific findings, the first finding was leadership. These included organizational structure, managerial style, organizational culture. and approaches to stakeholder engagement. In response to these findings, DEQ has, as you all are very aware, reorganized back into media-specific administration in 2018. We brought on a new water quality administrator and myself, and we also established the deputy water quality administrator position filled by Jennifer Weigel. We've also taken really important steps in improving our organizational culture and morale. At the leadership level back in 2018, we started the One Team for Clean Water initiative. That initiative was born out of visits to each of our regional offices by leadership team members. During these visits, we met with water quality staff in each of our regional offices, and we posed some questions to them on how are they feeling about the program? Are they seeing areas of improvement? What are we doing good? Well, where do we need to do better? We then we gathered all that information, all that feedback, and we, as a leadership team with our implementation administrator, Loriana, and Jennifer Weigel, myself, and our regional administrators, we got together and went through that feedback and prioritized what we want to work on over the next year is what we worked on in 2019. And so we, after culling all that information and prioritizing it, that work culminated in regular water quality newsletters sent to all the water quality staff. I mean, people really wanted to know what's going on across the water quality program. Where does their work fit into the greater picture of enhancing water quality in Oregon? We also had a water quality conference called H2 October last October, where we brought together water quality staff from across the state so people could learn more about all the different program areas and get to see each other face to face. And during this time, it's that event was even more valuable because we have folks that we've brought on into the water quality program that haven't met anyone face to face, that they've been brought on virtually. And so we were very grateful to have that opportunity. And we've also developed a water quality program plan and really increased focus on how the work of each water quality program affects the work of other programs across the water quality program broadly. So another finding that NWH made was regarding community capacity. And so this is really the ability of a community to address changing permit requirements. While we obviously at DEQ can't control the financial situations of our municipal permittees, we continue to prioritize the work of our Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which provides low interest loans, below market loans to governmental entities across the state. We are also working earlier and often with permittees to make sure they understand the permitting process and can begin work on collecting any necessary data and bringing on any necessary expertise before the real formal permitting process starts. We recognize that that water quality permitting isn't only about DEQ. We want to make sure that we're trying to make things as simple and clear for the permittees so that they understand the process and can be prepared to take on new permit requirements as we pick up their permits. We've also developed an annual and 5-year permit issuance plan. Both those plans identify facilities, both industrial and municipal, that we plan on working on for the next year, for the next 5 years. So the goal of that was really to let people know that, hey, your permit is on the list to get worked on. So let's start having those conversations now so that when we do get together, have our permit kickoff meeting, everybody, we're ready for that. We're ready for that conversation. We have the expertise and knowledge of the process so that we're working more efficiently, not just on the DEQ side, but also on the permittee side. There's another finding regarding alignment. This refers to the recognition that the permitting program doesn't operate in a vacuum. We cannot issue permits without up-to-date standards and TMDLs, as we just discussed. We rely on the programs to make sure that our permits are protective, implementable, and meet the goal of enhancing water quality in the state. This has been a focus area of our One Team for Clean Water effort, but also has been a focus in response to resource requests we made to the legislature. And we'll talk about some of those legislative conversations on our next agenda item, but it was recognized that the permitting program can't do some of the work without the TMDLs in place to issue permits, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we are aligned across the entire water quality program, finding efficiencies and leveraging the work to make sure that we're all doing our work with consideration to the entire water quality program. Quality efficiency, that really speaks for itself. We need to make sure that we're issuing quality permits, and give our staff effective and efficient tools to use when drafting permits. Quality efficiency is part of our continuous improvement efforts and has led to the development and refinement of our quality assurance process for every permit that we issue. And you'll hear a little bit more about that when we talk about the PG environmental report.
Justin, from the permittee's perspective, what, either from changes that have been made or changes that you're working on now, what do you think is the difference? I mean, do you think this system, after after receiving a report and identifying areas for needed improvement, what improvements do you think there is for the permittee? They may never be tremendously excited about permit renewal, and you can understand why, and yet we want the process to work as well for them as they can. So could you speak a little bit to what improvements a permittee might see after these areas of focus and improvement?
Yeah, I mean, one of the the biggest improvements that we've seen is just the engagement. When I started as a water quality administrator in 2018, there's a lot of frustration that permittees weren't being heard by the agency, and so sitting down with them and talking about our work. Okay, we're looking at your permit. Here's if we just go and say here are the requirements. That may not make sense for that specific facility. That may not be put in terminology that correlates to what the work that they're doing. It may not be truly representative of their operations. So what we're trying to do is work with them earlier and often to get a better understanding of the facility to develop an implementable permit. We can come up with a permit, but if that's not implementable, then we're not going to get the environmental protections that we're looking for. And working with a lot of our permittees, one of the big frustrations for them has been that they want to do capital projects. They want to change their operations and improve treatment, but with a permit, with administratively continued permit, they cannot do that. They can't change their operations unless the permit is modified to reflect those. Until basically DEQ does the assessment of those changes to make sure that they're appropriate and protective. And then incorporate it into a permit. So we have a lot of facilities and permittees, especially in communities, that want to do good environmental work, and the hindrance is the fact that they have an administratively continued permit.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we've also we'll talk a little bit on the next. I mean, a little bit later in the presentation, either on this agenda item or the next agenda item. But we have a group where we're really improving our outreach, having water quality roundtables, water quality forums with all the folks that are interested in water quality across the state. So we're just hearing more about what people's interests are, what their concerns are. And when we have really technical issues with permits, we have a permitting strategies group that meets regularly. We identify, here's some issues that are coming up. We know this new water quality standard is going to be issued. How can we be ready for that when that comes out? And then we have an implementation team that is really, who are the smart people we can get in the room to do that problem solving, so we're ready when that new regulation comes out. So that makes the new requirements that we'll be imposing more implementable, more likely to be implementable, and it allows everybody to plan and be prepared for new regulations as they come online. All right, next slide, please. So MWH identified staffing and workload as an issue. That's been a constant area of focus for the water quality program. To run an effective permit program, we need the appropriate expertise and number of staff to perform the large volume of work that the program does. One of the first steps we took to address this issue is to create a team of 8 permit writers that focus solely on permit writing. Prior to that, we had permit writers that were also going out and doing compliance inspections, reviewing compliance reports, responding to complaints. Those are often, varying skill sets. Those are also, big distractions. Writing these permits isn't flipping a switch. These are complex. This is hard work. And when you're having to stop that to go respond to a complaint or go do a compliance inspection, that could be disruptive to the process. And also having that team of 8 really allowed us to focus on building up the expertise in the different subject matter areas. So we had the right people doing the right work across the state. The next finding regarding funding kind of correlates to that staffing and workload. finding. We have to have the proper support for the permit program to perform the required work. So a major step that was taken by the agency was the development of our agency request budget for the 2019 session, where we let it known that we have a very large resource need in the water quality program. I believe that our agency request budget included 50 plus positions just in the water quality program. Through the governor's budget and work with the legislature, our legislatively approved budget culminated in 23 new positions supported by the legislature. And this was across multiple program areas in the water quality program. These, like we talked about before, this wasn't just permit writing positions. These are positions in our standards program, positions in our TMDL program, positions in our data management programs, so that we're recognizing once again that alignment finding that that permitting doesn't operate in a vacuum. We need all those resources to do the permitting work that we need to get done. And finally, NWH recognized the importance of progress reporting. Making sure that we develop metrics that are implementable and measurable are important to make progress in the permit backlog. The common phrase, what gets measured gets done, exists for a reason. And I find myself saying that a lot. To track our progress, we have regular emails to management and leadership providing the status of our permitting work. We issue an annual permit program report every year to talk about how our work is going, what permits we issued, what specific issues we worked on, obstacles we found, etc. And we include permit issuance as part of our agency's quarterly measure reporting. We're further refining our work on how we track our progress, which will lead me to turn over this presentation to Jeff Rabinowitz, who is our permitting program manager, and he's actually going to show us an example of one of these progress reports, and then also move on to some of the specifics in the PG environmental report. So I'll turn it over to Jeff Rabinowitz.
Actually, Justin, before you turn it over, this is Molly. I really appreciate this update and the report out here. It's been very helpful, but I would like to kind of talk about the staffing and workload just a minute, because I know when you were readjusting the organization and creating kind of those dedicated permit writers, there was some discussion about the experience they needed, the training they needed, and kind of the difficulty actually in creating that core permit writing team. It's been a little bit of time since that last conversation, and your update here touched on that, but I was wondering if you could go a little bit deeper in that staffing and their workload component. Have you been able to get the dedicated staff that you need? Have they been able to get the training? Have they been able to settle into this kind of new role of dedicated permit writing, which is different, as you said, than what they were doing before?
Yeah, and thank you very much for that question, Commissioner Kyle. Great question. And I really have seen that team working well together and identifying their roles as permit writers. We have identified subject matter experts within the permitting program. Some of in our permit writing program, those experts aren't writing permits themselves on a daily basis. They're supporting the permit writers on specific topic areas like temperature or mercury, something like that. So we have set up those subject matter experts. We did have an EPA training, and I believe that was last year, early to middle of last year. We had EPA come in to Oregon, and it was just 2 blocks away from our office in Portland, and came and did a permit writer training for our staff so that we could build up that expertise. Training for me is always something that is important, not just on a building up the technical capacity expertise that we need, but just as an investment in staff, showing our permit writers that we care about them, their career, we want them to be the highest professionals that they can be, and invest in their career. So we have done that permit writer training, and we do talk to EPA about finding additional opportunities for training to build up the expertise. And in fact, Jeff will be able to talk a little bit more about our subject matter expert program, because that was one of the specific findings that PG Environmental made in their report. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Justin. For the record, this is Jeff Rabinowitz, Water Quality Permit and Program Development Manager from DEQ. Thank you, Chair George, Commissioners, and Director Whitman for allowing me to speak today. If we can go to the next slide. So actually quite excited about this slide as Justin was talking about the reporting and metrics, something that we were developing towards the beginning part of 2020, and it coincided very well with the teleworking, is a weekly progress report. And this is something that all of my staff, myself, and also the regional permit writers complete. What that progress report then does is, it's probably somewhere around 15, about 17, 18 of them. They kind of work their way into a weekly report that gets put together. So what you're seeing in front of you right now is a dashboard of that weekly report. This does not contain every single parameter that we measure, but it does include quite a bit of quantitative information, which we're actually quite excited about. The dashboard in front of you is about a week and a half, 2 weeks old, so it's not the most up-to-date information, but it's pretty close. So just to highlight a couple of the key areas, in the first row on the left-hand side, you see number of permits issued. So obviously we're trying to work towards that backlog reduction, so this is a great piece of information. The second row, and apologize about how much information is there, these are the individual steps basically, or components of writing a permit. So this is cumulative within the measurable time period, which goes back to middle of March through beginning of July. How many hours in total have been spent for each component within writing the permit. This gives us a lot of really good insight and good information, so we can figure out where there are areas that we can do efficiency increases, where we're spending our time, and then over a longer time period, obviously 3-4 months is not a huge universe to be measuring, but over the coming months and years, it'll really be able to show how we're improving in those areas. So just to highlight a couple of these, you notice a lot of hours were spent towards fact sheet development. As I'll touch on that in a second, we've made some improvements there. Our QA process, which I'll also touch on in a little bit, is probably the second most amount of hours that we use. I guess it'll probably be the fourth row. That is actually the time spent by our subject matter experts. Again, this is what Justin was touching on, and the area of expertise to make sure that we're able to get the information to the permit writers to be able to complete and write the permits. So the highest amount, just looking at that, looks like it's temperature. So in the last three and a half months, we've spent about 160 hours from a subject matter expert perspective just on temperature. We've made some changes to the subject matter expert process, and I'll touch on that in a little bit.
So can I jump in for a second? Because you said that a lot of hours were spent, and sorry, this is Molly. A lot of hours were spent on fact sheet development. So kind of, I'm trying to recall, or I am recalling an update that we had when I was first brought on as a commissioner, which was that the permit writers were spending a lot of time in consultation with folks in order to kind of explain processes and train permittees on how to obtain permits. And there was some discussion of whose role was that? Was that DEQ's role? Was it Aquam's and other groups? And is the fact sheet that you're developing kind of that information that then can be used to explain the process to permit people who want permits in order to free up time in the future? You know, once you have that kind of information and that instructions available and easy to use, that should then free up time in the future. Is that what that fact sheet writing component is?
I think I can, Commissioner Kyle, appreciate that question. I think I could answer part of that, you know, there was a big conversation especially a couple of years ago, would go about technical assistance. Whose role is it to educate a facility on requirements? And that is something that we continue to work with our permittees on, and finding that balance where we're still staying on the regulator side of the fence, making sure that we're fulfilling our role as a regulator, but with that but at the same time, we're not leaving our permittees kind of out to dry and not understanding what it is that we're asking of them. We can say, oh, well, that's not our fault, but that becomes our problem, because then we have a permit that's not implementable. So that's a continuing conversation, the kind of the technical assistance conversation. The fact sheet development is really the fact sheet is the written justification for the various permit conditions that we have in the permit. And so the fact sheet does also kind of help support that role of educating the permittee. One of the things that we've been focusing on across the water quality program is documenting our decisions, so that we're not, especially if we have had a permit that's been renewed in 10 or 11 years, staff may have turned over either on the DEQ side or the facility side. And so having a good fact sheet that explains why we made the determinations and imposed the requirements that we did documents that, and does provide that level of education to the facility. It also provides a level of education to the public. So when a member of the public is looking at a facility that's getting permitted, in their neighborhood, in their town, in their community, they can look at that and understand, what the operation of the facility is like, and why we're imposing the requirements that we are. And the fact sheet development, that is quite extensive, as you can imagine, because we're kind of really going through and providing a narrative of all the work that we've done to develop that permit.
Okay, so thank you. That's a useful clarification. I wasn't sure of the terms, and that explains the hours, because you're doing that then for each permit.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, this is Jeffrey Ben once again, just to add a little bit to the fact sheet. We're implementing a new fact sheet template that will kind of streamline that process, still contain all the needed and required information that we want to show, but make it a little less cumbersome to read through. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, please.
Real quick.
Commissioner Barrasso.
Jeff, one thing I guess about the fact sheet is that's not a new, just to be clear, that's not a new process. That's something you all have done prior to these updates and these revisions to the process that have been going on. I just want to check in on that. And is there any foreseeable, is there any prediction on whether that, because you've done them for so many folks, and yes, it's customized to each facility, but is there anything about that that's going to change moving forward? Just seeing how much time that takes, I want to know whether that's new and whether that will change moving forward. Yeah.
Sure, thank you, Commissioner, for that question. It is actually a requirement in the Clean Water Act to have a fact sheet, so they're not going to be going away in their entirety in any way, shape, or form in the near future. So we've been doing these for quite a long while. It's kind of focusing on what we put in there and how we put the information in there. So just as one example, if we were putting a lot of information in maybe previous fact sheets that were adding to the time about things that were not permit requirements. So if a facility did not have a recycled water plan, we might be spelling out why they don't have a recycled water plan, which is probably a little bit more information than we needed to put into the fact sheet, simply just kind of cross-referencing. So we're really just trying to make it a little bit more streamlined, and we also made it parallel the flow of the permit template itself. So if someone is reading both, the sections, how they're numbered and all that will kind of go hand in hand. Okay, as Justin was touching on earlier, the MWH report, and about 2 years after that, and some initial actions that DEQ took that were quite pivotal, sorry about that, we had the PG Environmental report, and what that consisted of was PG Environmental, which is a consulting company that primarily works for federal and state agencies. And they came out and actually wrote some permits for us. I believe it was 2 permits, if I remember correctly. It's a little bit before my time here, but I think it was 2 permits. What was interesting about that process is that they utilized our processes. So they used our application and file review, how we compile the data, our data that we had, They used our tools for the reasonable potential analysis and to calculate any type of effluent limit. They used our forms at that time for the permit and the fact sheet development, went through the applicant review process, and they basically took it all the way through to just about the final permit issuance. We, of course, DEQ had to sign the permit, but they went through the whole process. And what that really provided them was a very in-depth view of what we do in areas that they could recommend for improvement. Sure. So this allowed them to then write a much more detailed report than NWH, because they saw what our microprocesses were, if you will. So I will now touch on those actual recommendations. So next slide, please. Much like MWH, there were 7 main recommendations. I don't know what's magic about the number 7, but that's what we're going to go with. So with that, I'll just kind of jump in. One of the first things they talked about is modernizing the permit development process. So DEQ's existing program was not taking full advantage of standardized permitting practices. As a result of the recommendation, DEQ is now utilizing permit and fact sheet templates. We are updating these on a regular basis. We're also now using detailed and highly technical Excel-based spreadsheets that assess water quality data in order to perform reasonable potential analysis and develop subsequent effluent limits. So these spreadsheets, which are on our website, so any of the facilities are able, and applicants are able to use exactly the same thing as we're using to kind of help them throughout that process up front and during the process to check on how we're doing things. But these are extremely, very, very technical type of spreadsheets. The second point that the PG Environmental Report made goes back to the subject matter expert aspect and the technical expertise. Because of staff turnover or expecting staff to know everything about an extremely detailed and complicated process, we had to make some changes. So those changes that PG Environmental recommended was the use of subject matter experts. To address the program, we now have the formalized experts. They act as both as a resource and a technical clearinghouse for the permit writers. The utilization of the subject matter experts is self-imposed, but we're using it as a required step within the permit writing process. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but it's probably a good time to just mention it. We've actually just very recently, within the last few weeks, changed how we're using the subject matter experts. They are now part of what we call the QA, the quality assurance process, and we're utilizing the subject matter experts on the front end of permit development. So we're getting a lot of the technical questions answered and addressed up front, and that's already, even just after a few permits being written, is already showing very promising increases in efficiency. The third point that the report made is evaluating the readiness of all the existing permits when the report was written, which I believe was about 2018. PG Environmental, and rightfully so, suggested that we need to understand which of the backlog permits we had that were ready to be written immediately, which we needed to get additional information and data from, and which were waiting on perhaps TMDLs to be written. So we did that analysis on a couple 100+ permits, 250 permits, I believe, or thereabout. And we utilized that information to develop the initial 1-year and 5-year permit issuance plans. Those plans get updated on a yearly basis now. So the 1-year and the 5-year continuously will be updated. This is also helping a lot of the facilities start to plan ahead for when they need to do things. If they see that they're on the 2022, 2023 plan, they now have an idea of how that's going to work with their planning processes. So it does create a much better dialogue between us. The fourth point is improving the acquisition and use of data needed for the individual Npds permit development. So what we did here, and this was a natural progression from the readiness evaluation, is focus on data review taken in support of the permit writing process. Specifically, the existing water quality data is assessed to determine if it will allow for a complete picture to be developed for each permit. Further, many parameters, such as temperature, are assessed so as to provide the facilities with a pre-permit information that will allow them to decide how they want to plan for any type of facility improvements or upgrades. Related, the method of data submission is being standardized to meet federal reporting requirements, to make the process more predictable for the facilities, and to allow DEQ to better utilize the submitted data to write a more defensible and implementable permit that protects water quality. Okay, and we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, very good. So the fifth point that they discussed is establishing a more robust QA review to ensure that the permits are developed consistently. That was, I guess, a historical complaint that what was said in one permit, even the format of the permit would be different in different parts of the state. So obviously we wanted to address that very quickly. So a formalized QA process has been developed. This helps with that consistency across all regions. It provides direct feedback to the permit writers, provides feedback to management on trends and areas that need improvement. Where do we need more of that training, for instance? And of course, provides for a higher quality permit. The QA step has been modified by, as I mentioned, by the recent implementation of the subject matter expert process, which is front-loading that technical review again. And we are already starting to see a decrease in the amount of FTE hours on the QA side. What we're going to be very interested in watching from that progress reporting is hopefully both a reduction in the subject matter expert hours and the QA review hours. That will really show us that we're kind of gotten to that right spot. The sixth point that PG Environmental focused on is our decision-making process, and that's kind of a very broad term, but we were getting stuck on making decisions, or if we had disagreements, permits could be derailed for weeks, months, sometimes more. So they identified, and we fully agreed with, we needed to modify that process to make it much more streamlined on how we make decisions, and if there are those areas of disagreements, how we handle those, escalate those, and get those rectified. So we've been using the RACI method, which basically assigns responsibility, accountability, consult, and inform to different levels of people involved in each of the processes. So that has already been going for I think quite a bit. I think over a year now. We've refined it a couple times, and it is certainly showing that decisions that may have taken, as I said, weeks or more likely months, are now being solved in days or weeks. So we're very happy with that response. Finally, and as was already mentioned, it's the shifting workloads and of the staff that we had, and they were not prioritizing or focusing just on Npds permit writing. So that has been pretty much addressed across the board now. So just to kind of give you a quick overview of what we have a dedicated team of permit writers that equals 8 FTEs right now. QA reviewers, from an FTE standpoint, it's about 1 to 1.5 FTEs. We have 3 people that can do it, but it's not a full-time type of job duty. Subject matter experts, probably again an equivalent of 3 to 4 FTEs. Direct support, so this is part of that RACI decision-making aspect where it kind of pyramids up. So direct support, we have 2 FTEs that handle a lot of that consistency aspect during the permit writing itself. We of course have management, and all of this allows for a much more focused approach to issuing Npds permits, further reducing the historically high permit backlog.
And Jeff and Justin, this is Molly again. Could you just kind of remind me of the timeline when these changes were implemented into the program? Are these, have these shifts, and particularly kind of the staffing around the permit writing, has this been in effect for just a year or the 2 years that this restructuring is, or has it been longer? You know, like how long have these changes been enacted?
Sure, Kyle, thank you for the question. And I may ask Director Whitmer for some help here, because I know some of this predates me, but I know that the team of, what we're calling the team of 8 permit writers was relatively new when I started just over 2 years ago. As we've had, turnover in retirements and stuff like that, or people leaving the agency, we've been making sure that we backfill that to make sure that we have that number there. So the team of 8, I would say is about 2 or 2.5 years old. If Director Whitman has any clarifying information on that, obviously feel free to identify that. But that was really the start of creating a permit writing team, and from there we really started working on all the details of issuing a permit from there. Now we have the team. They can all talk together. How should we organize? Who's doing what? What are the processes they need? And so we were really grateful to have that MWH report, which identified that establishing that team of 8. And we got that report in 2016. So that puts that right around the 2.5-year period in 2017 to get that team going. And then the PG environmental report came in and allowed us to make really more subtle and specific changes to how we operated within that group.
But Chair George, the only thing I'll add is the team, the permit writing team, is actually more like 3.5 years old. It was initially headed by Keith Anderson, who was on special assignment, is an advisor to me on this work. But the important point here is what Justin said, which is it's one thing to designate a team and even a team leader and tell them to go off and start doing good. It's another thing to get all the systems in place so that it is really functioning. And that's the work that Justin and Jeff have really been doing since they came in. So it's been in place a little bit longer, but in terms of really functioning the way I think we expect it to, it's quite a bit more recent.
Okay. I don't know if Chair George was trying to say that. I think you may have been on mute.
I was. I hope I'm off now.
Yes.
Please continue. Go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, at this point, I was going to turn it back over to Justin to discuss the permit backlog litigation and settlement actions.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Chair George, as many of you all are aware, there is litigation related to our permit backlog. This litigation was resolved in 2018 with a consent judgment opposing a number of milestones and requirements for the permitting program. We highlighted some of those requirements and milestones here. The big ones are updating 148 of the oldest administratively extended permits, issuing annual and 5-year permit issuance plans. To plan our work, performing data gap analyses. That was a big focus of conversations within DEQ and during the settlement of this litigation. That once again goes to what data do we need to issue a protective permit, and how are we identifying those gaps so that we have that information handy when we go to pick up that permit. There's also that we would conduct permit writer training. If we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, we'd also utilize subject matter experts, have a QA assurance process, and develop annual reports to have that transparency and show the work that we're doing. And to date, DEQ has met all the requirements of the settlement agreement. That settlement agreement is a 10-year settlement, has milestones and requirements throughout that 10 years. So we're in compliance with those requirements now. There are contingencies built into the obligations that DEQ committed itself to, so that if certain, if standards or TMDLs get litigated, there's a budget crisis, something like that, there are some contingencies in there. But as I said, to date, DEQ has met all the requirements of that settlement agreement. And I think Stephanie's trying to move me along, so I think we're taking some time on this permit, and you'll have to listen to me again for the next agenda item. So she's probably trying to spare you all from my monotone voice as well. But so where does the rubber meet the road? The rubber meets the road at how are we doing? Right now we have 28% of our permits are current. So I talked before about in 2015 our backlog was greater than 80%. And now we're down to 72%. And that means 92 of the 331 individual Npds permits are current. In 2018 we took action on 34 permits. 2019 was 24 permits. There was a dip there. We anticipated that as we talked about that readiness review. What permits we had all the data and information needed to issue the permit. Let's focus on those. So we knew that we'd have a higher number in 2018 and a little bit lower number in 2019. But in 2020, so far we've issued 31 permits to date. We expect to issue several more permits before the end of the federal fiscal year, and I should have made that clarification. We do use the federal fiscal year for the quantification of these numbers, but we're really pleased with the progress that we're making in 2020, and we're working on several of the oldest administratively continued permits in the state, and we've actually issued a permit for the largest discharger in the state just this spring. The Portland Columbia Boulevard facility. So there have been a lot of successes in the permit program due to all the hard work that's been going on for several years and that we've summarized here. We're not going to pat ourselves on the back and take our foot off the gas pedal. We recognize that this is a priority. Ultimately, if we want to keep all of our permits current, we're going to have to be issuing 64 permits a year. And it is my goal to keep all of our permits current. I think that's an obligation of a credible water quality program and what the environment and water quality in Oregon deserves. So we are going to continue to work hard internally, work hard externally, continue to work with stakeholders, permittees, non-governmental organizations, and the commission to do everything we need to do to meet the goals of the water quality permit program.
Justin, this is Molly. I just want to really kind of make sure I understand this. So when in 2017, 2018, we were 80% of the permits were out of date, and we're now down to 72%. So we've made an 8% gain on that backlog. Is that it?
No, I believe the percentage was about 80. It was either 84 or 82%. Don't quote me on that. So it's about a 10 to 12% improvement since 2018.
Okay, because this is incredibly important in order to make sure that the actual outcome that we're trying to achieve, which is clean water, making sure that we're hitting our water quality parameters, both for ecological and human health, this is the control mechanism that we have. So getting through those backlogs, as Commissioner George mentioned, until the permits become current, they're not necessarily using the updated water quality parameters either. So this is an important cog in the wheel of making sure that we do have water that is of the quality that we expect.
Absolutely, appreciate that. And as I said, we will, this remains the number one priority for us in the water quality program. And we will continue to be working very hard and are very appreciative of all the support that the commission's given us, all the work that our staff has done, support from the legislature as well as from permittees who have been engaging with us to improve this process.
All right, thank you. Well, and I think as Justin previewed, I think we just continue to roll on here with Justin and Jeff. So let's keep going right into our next agenda item.
All right. Thank you, Chair George, members of the Commission, Director Whitman. For the record, my name is Justin Green, the Water Quality Administrator for DEQ's Water Quality Program. Also appearing with me is Ryan Vandenhoof, our Senior Policy Analyst. We also will have Jeff Rabinowitz available for any more information that he can provide. Today, we are recommending that the Commission adopt the proposed amendments to Oregon's water quality permitting rules contained in Oregon Administrative Regulation 340, Divisions 45 and 71. These fees contained in those rules would fund the positions the agency worked hard with stakeholders and legislators to support water quality permitting work within DEQ during the 2019 legislative session. The DEQ Water Quality Program is essential for the environmental health of Oregon's waters. The program is technical in nature, critical to protect Oregon's rivers, lakes, streams, and groundwater for human health and the environment. In light of the COVID-19 related economic uncertainty and potential hardship for some entities subject to fee increases, DEQ has developed two options for implementing fees necessary to support the program enhancements authorized by the 2019 legislature. To be clear, the proposed fee increases that we're discussing today are not to make up for any potential budget decreases due to COVID, but are to fund positions approved by the 2019 legislature. We welcome questions as we proceed through the presentation, so please feel free to stop us at any time, and I will move on to the next slide. So our presentation today will provide information on permitting program improvements and workload analyses, some of which you've heard, so we'll try to work through those, keeping an eye on time. We'll talk about the legislative background and the 2019-21 budget development process. We'll provide details of the proposed fee implementation to support new investments in the water quality program and DEQ's recommendation to the EQC regarding this rulemaking. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as you all just heard, the water quality permitting program has long struggled with permit development and renewal. This has resulted in various program deficiencies, including a backlog of expired wastewater permits. The water quality program has successfully implemented initial recommendations identified by independent consultants, but we require additional resources to sustain the progress and enable the program to meet near-term and long-term goals. I mean, you saw that we are making progress in getting permits out the door in the last slide of the last agenda item. But like I mentioned, we to keep all of our permits current, we need to be around 64 permits. So these new resources the resources that we're talking about today will support permit writing and the water quality permitting program broadly. These resources will benefit not just DEQ, but the regulated community, public health, and the environment. They'll sustain that momentum on our permitting process improvements and address other program deficiencies as well. One of the things that the MWH report highlighted was that if recommended actions are only partially implemented, the backlog problem that has persisted is unlikely to diminish measurably, and the program will fail to achieve a sustainable level of operation. Next slide, please. And so obviously I just talked in the last agenda item. I could talk all day about the water quality permitting program, but I want to stop to take a moment to reiterate that DEQ's water quality permitting program has real impacts on the environment, permittees, and public health. For example, we recently updated the City of Portland's Columbia Boulevard wastewater treatment plant permit, which is the largest single discharger in the state. That renewal was a holistic look at the facility, but also provided for more stringent standards for pollutants such as pH and total residual chlorine standards. We also renewed permits for several communities that did not have mercury requirements in their permits, and will now have mercury immunization plan requirements to meet human health criteria and fish consumption standards. We're also working on our oldest administratively continued permit. This renewed permit will provide discharge limits for pollutants previously unregulated, as well as update existing discharge standards. However, this is not all about the DEQ imposing new requirements on permittees. The communities and facilities we work with care about their environmental impacts and want to undertake capital projects to improve their operations and treatment levels. Without a renewed permit documenting and approving those upgrades, those projects can't be undertaken and the community cannot reduce their environmental impact. There's also the fundamental issue of fairness with everybody having an updated permit, providing a level playing field. Similar operations in a similar geographical area may not have the same requirements because one facility has had its permit renewed and the other facility hasn't. It's important that we get the same environmental improvement and establish a level playing field for dischargers across the state. Also want to highlight that if we don't have TMDLs in place, we can't permit new facilities coming into a community. This has a big impact on you know, like on rural and smaller communities are trying to go through economic development. If we're not developing our TMDLs, we cannot, you know, permits can't be renewed and dischargers cannot be permitted in impaired water bodies that do not have a TMDL. So the TMDLs are really an important part of the permitting program because they establish the new standards that we incorporate into our renewals, but they also allow communities to make decisions on their economic futures. Next slide, please. So the positions funded by the proposed fee increases we are discussing today represent agreement among multiple stakeholders and key legislators about the desired future state of the water quality permitting program. This chart shows where we believe we will be with the backlog with present resources, as well as where we would be with the positions authorized in the fee increase. As you can see, with only existing resources, we continue to muddle around a 50 to 60% permit backlog. With newly authorized positions funded with this proposed fee increase, we feel we can keep the larger amount of permits current, protect water quality, and allow for communities and facilities to improve and enhance their operations. Important to note that this is a focus on permitting work only. It doesn't address operations and deficiencies that continue in compliance and technical support. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the last agenda item, and as the commission likely recalls, DEQ and the water quality program made a large ask for resources in the last biennium to highlight the dramatic needs of the program. DEQ's request budget included 59 new water quality positions over 12 different policy option packages. The governor's recommended budget included 27 new permitting positions. After extensive collaboration, engagement, and work with stakeholders in the legislature, the legislatively approved budget included 23 new positions across multiple programs and policy option packages in the water quality program. Next slide, please. And so the fee increase we're discussing today would fund 11 positions that provide direct and indirect benefits to water quality permitting efficiency and efficacy, including statewide resources for permit development, standards variance development and alternative compliance strategies, coordination, compliance assurance, facility inspections, data management, IT support, and systems improvements. These additional resources are expected to provide a major boost to the process improvements we've already begun, which will modernize the permit issuance process, provide significant improvements for customer service, and increase our ability to provide quality permits in a timely manner. And so, as we discussed before, we issue a wide variety of permits. We have individual Npds and WPCF permits covering surface water and groundwater discharges. We have general permits covering those same discharges. They cover a wide variety of facilities, such as domestic wastewater facilities, domestic on-site, which are generally the non-discharging groundwater protection permits, industrial wastewater discharges, as well as stormwater discharges.
And Justin, sorry to keep interrupting you, but this is Molly again. I read in the reports that you gave us that it seems like to address the Npds permits, you've actually pulled from the WCF program a little bit, right? So how does that, that doesn't seem like a sustainable path forward.
Commissioner Kyle, thank you for that question. I absolutely agree. It isn't a sustainable path forward. My understanding from just talking to folks that are familiar with the water quality program historically in Oregon is that at one point our backlog was small and it was somewhat manageable, but then it was recognized that the compliance work wasn't getting done. The inspections and the compliance report reviews weren't getting done. So resources shifted to the compliance work. And that was one of the factors that eventually led to the permit backlog, is because we're constantly taking from one part of the program to address another part of the program. And so the 19 to 21 legislative or agency request budget, really, we laid that out. We try to tell that story of here are the resources we really need to do all the work that we need to do across the water quality program in a sustainable and manageable way. We can't continue to deprive resources and work from one area to address another, because all we're doing is just fixing one problem while creating another. And so our approach has been to, and the approach with the positions that we received this last legislative session was to look across the whole water quality program and say where are the needs and how can we address all those needs so that we're addressing multiple areas of the water quality program. But during that, obviously a large focus was on addressing the permit backlog. But to be very direct, yes, we have less people working on WPCF permits in the past because we are bringing them over to work on Npds permits. Next slide, please. And so this is going, getting into the details of the proposed fee increase. Oregon Revised Statute 468B.051, DEQ is authorized to increase fees up to 3% when it's anticipated there will be an increase in the cost of administrating the permit program at the current service level. And so what this table is simply showing that at our current service level, with the same number of positions that we have now, our costs are increasing substantially from the 27-19 biennium to the 2019-21 biennium. And so the part of the fee increase that we're talking about is to use the 3% increase authorized by that statute to cover just the cost of running the program as it stands right now. You'll see that we provided information on the kind of the program costs covered by fees as well as by lottery funds and general fund and then federal funding. There has been kind of a historic agreement that fees would cover about 60% of the permit positions, and then other funds would cover, or not other funds, but general fund would cover the other 40%. We are a little out of whack there. That's because although we are authorized for 3% increase every year, or every year, that generally still doesn't cover the cost of, doesn't cover the increased costs of our positions and of our work each year. So while we are very grateful for that 3%, that really does cover what our actual increase in costs are. Next slide, please. And so this table shows the total water quality permitting program legislatively adopted budget for the 19 to 21 biennium with the program enhancements approved by the 2019 legislature under policy option packages 122 and 127. In addition to the 3% fee increase we just talked about, the additional 18% fee increase described here and proposed in this rulemaking is needed to support the legislatively adopted program enhancements in the 2019 to 21 biennium. As discussed with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee this past fall and proposed in draft form for the public comment period in December, January of 2019 and 2020, these tables assume full implementation effective by July 1st, 2020 of both the 3% annual increase and the additional 18% increase. While the 3% increase is applied across the board to all applicable fee types, the 18% is being applied to all but the MS4, the Municipal Storm Sewer System annual fee payers. And that's because the annual MS4 permit fees are being excluded because we recently implemented a significant fee increase for annual MS4 permit fees to support work in that program. So while they are part of the 3% increase to cover increasing costs for our current service level, as discussed with the rulemaking committee, we are not adding them to the 18% increase that is being proposed in this rulemaking. Next slide, please. So the wastewater permit budget is largely driven by costs associated with FTE, as you can see here. The numbers presented in this pie chart represent the 2019 to 21 legislative adopted wastewater permitting budget by major expense categories, excluding program enhancements authorized under the POPs 122 and 127 legislative adopted in 19 to 21 biennium. The reason we're excluding the policy option packages from this pie chart is because we're trying to use the pie chart to reflect which costs in the base budget are driving the need for the annual 3% increase. In other words, the 3% fee increase is not being used to fund program enhancements. It's the 18% portion of the overall fee increase that's supporting the enhancements. So personnel services include salary, benefits, PERS contributions. Services and supplies costs include rent, general fund, and lottery fund indirect, which are interagency transfers, attorney general costs, professional services for things like information system development and maintenance, telecommunications, employee travel and trading, et cetera. Capital outlay costs include technical equipment replacement and repair at DEQ's laboratory, as well as telecommunications and computer hardware purchases. Special payments represent the wastewater permitting program's share of an Oregon State police officer. So this is just kind of a visual of what the permitting program budget looks like. And just so you know, just another clarification that our agency indirect costs pay for DEQ central services costs, such as human resources, accounting, and our IT section, which is obviously doing a lot of work right now with EVMS. And so I will now turn things over to Ryan Vandenhoef to discuss fee implementation and fee implementation options that we're proposing due to the current COVID situation.
Thank you, Justin, and good afternoon, commissioners. For the record, my name is Ryan Vandenhoef, Senior Policy Analyst for Water Quality Programs here at DEQ. The agency convened a rulemaking advisory committee beginning in August of last year, pre-COVID, to provide recommendations on preferred approaches for generating the fee revenue that's necessary to fully implement the investments in our water quality programs established by the 2019 legislature. Committee participants generally favored an across-the-board increase of most water quality fee types at a sufficient magnitude to support phasing in the new positions throughout the first half of this biennium, in accordance with the legislatively authorized hiring schedule. This recommendation then became the basis for the draft proposal that DEQ released for public comment between mid-November and early January of this year. However, in light of the more recent economic uncertainty and conditions resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, DEQ has prepared today two different fee implementation options for your consideration. Option 1, described here on slide number 12, most closely reflects the original baseline strategy that went out for public comment as a draft rule. This option proposes a 21% increase on most water quality permit fees effective August 2020, which is notably just 2 months later than what was anticipated or reflected in the agency's legislatively approved budget. This 21% includes two components. First is the annual 3% increase for calendar year 2020 for all water quality fee types that support increasing costs associated with continued service levels of the program. The second component is the 18%, which is for most water quality fee types to support the enhancements authorized in policy option packages 122 and 127 of the 2019-21 legislatively approved budget. Package 122 phases in one new permanent position in our standard section for variance related work, while package 127 phases in 8 new permanent positions. It increases one existing part-time position to a full-time position and funds one limited duration position. All of these positions are to be supported by a mix of fee revenue and general fund or public fund support at a 60-40 ratio. The notable exception in this is the annual permit fees for the municipal separate storm sewer systems, commonly referred to as the MS4s, which are excluded from the 18% increase, but not from the 3% annual adjustment component. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, DEQ has prepared a second alternative fee implementation option for your consideration that's described on slide number 13. Both options, option 1 and 2, eventually achieve the fee increase necessary to support the new resources authorized by the legislature, albeit over differing timescales and with differing impacts on DEQ's ability to implement the new resources and follow through on program service commitments to the regulated community and to our stakeholders. This option 2 proposes deferring a portion of the fee increase by 1 year. Under this option, applicable fees would increase by up to 13% effective August 2020, but with the remaining portion of the full fee increase being delayed until July of 2021. The first step increase of 13% is meant to represent the 3% annual increase to support continued service levels and slightly more than half of the increase that's needed to support the newly authorized positions. The resulting budget reduction to our water quality permitting program from this option would require a delay of hiring some of the new legislatively authorized positions and a commensurate delay in implementing some of the program service enhancements. Similar to option 1, the fee increase proposed under this option would apply to all applicable water quality fee types except for the MS4 annual permit fees, which are excluded except for the 3%. Next slide, please. In recognizing the economic challenges that many are facing resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic, DEQ also has examined options for providing some fee relief where appropriate and where necessary. The agency, under the Director's authority provided by OAR 340-045-0070, can offer additional fee deferment options via installment plans for entities that demonstrate economic hardships, either resulting from COVID-19 or other circumstances. The agency is prepared to more proactively communicate this option to permittees as a result of either of these options if adopted. For entities that request and are granted an installment plan, the deferred payment schedule will not incur any additional interest or additional fees, but would rather just allow a permittee to pay their fees over a specified period of time within the permit year. In addition to this paid deferment option, the EQC has authority to reduce or suspend fees for entities that demonstrate economic hardship. Request for an annual fee reduction or suspension would need to be submitted to the Commission and evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Both the fee deferment option as well as a fee reduction option would be available under either of these implementation options that we are presenting for you here today. Next slide. Slide 15 provides a brief comparison and contrast of these two different options and the resulting impacts to permittees, as well as impacts to the agency. As described, the 21% increase associated with option 1 would be immediately effective and would result in near full implementation of new resource investments authorized by the 2019 legislature, including the anticipated program service enhancements. Establishing the fee increase effective in August rather than June as originally budgeted would result in a 3% reduction in projected fee revenue for the fiscal year, but the hiring of all 11 new positions would be expected to occur with only minor delays from the original hiring plan. In contrast, option 2 would provide enough revenue to support the program enhancements that already had come online before COVID. However, the 1-year delay in full fee increase implementation would require an approximate 1-year delay in the hiring of 4 of the 11 new positions. Overall, option 2 would result in approximately a 10% budget reduction in anticipated program fee revenue for this fiscal year, and would result in delayed implementation of some of the program improvement recommendations. Without any fee increases, I will note, DEQ would need to reduce permitting staff and delay or abandon significant aspects of the permitting program's enhancements recommended by third-party consultants and by recommendations that are anticipated by a variety of stakeholders. I also want to note that in the event that the legislature or the governor direct further budget reductions to general fund or lottery funds this biennia, the program will have to hold positions vacant and implement additional cuts that could further hinder strides towards program improvements. Next slide. The agency understands that even though the proposed fee increases have been forecasted to our water quality stakeholders and permittees for over a year, and in many cases already incorporated into budget planning, any increase during times of an economic downturn as we're facing right now may be challenging and in some cases very difficult to accommodate. For your reference, we wanted to provide this table that is a small sampling of the different fee types, their current fees, the forecasted amount pending a full 21% increase, and in the far right-hand column, providing some perspective on the dollar amount increase associated with this rulemaking proposal. Annual fee amounts range widely in the fee tables that we have for the water quality program, from many that are under $1,000 per year to a few that can be much greater. The large municipal permits based on wastewater flow volume can reach into the tens of thousands of dollars. In fact, the highest one is approaching $100,000 per year. Although the average of all 187 water quality fee types affected by this rulemaking is around $6,600, the median is just over $1,000. The annual fee examples that are noted on this slide include municipal wastewater permits for both mid-size and very small communities, a relatively common on-site septic system permit that serves larger businesses, RV parks, or clusters of residences such as rural subdivisions or manufactured home parks that cannot be serviced by municipal sewer lines. I've also included a relatively common underground injection control individual permit, an individual Npds permit for sawmill and logging operations, and also 2 different types of general permits, both the construction, stormwater, and seafood processing general permits. As you can see from this small subset of examples, operations that are eligible for general permits tend to have significantly lower annual permit costs than operations that require an individualized permit. Next slide, please. So because of the great variety in fee types and amounts involved with our water quality fee tables, we've prepared this graph showing the median water quality permit annual invoice amount in order to provide a generalized perspective on the scale and timing by which fees would be increasing under these 2 different fee options. Currently, of the approximately 4,000 entities that are covered under a water quality annual permit, half have an annual permit invoice that is less than the median of $1,009, and half pay more than that amount. Water quality permit annual invoices are sent out throughout the year based upon permit effective date, with roughly 1/12 of invoices being issued each month. Therefore, if option 1 were adopted, a 21% increase would be seen on invoices for those entities receiving invoices in August of 2020, while those entities that received their invoices in July would not see the increase until next summer. If option 2 were adopted, the first step of the increase, 13%, would be observed on invoices sent out beginning next month. And then the second step of the increase would be observed on invoices sent out sometime between summer of 2021 through summer of 2022, depending on a permitted entity's invoice date. Lastly, I'd just like to reiterate that in addition to the increase necessary to support these newly authorized positions, this fee increase includes the statutorily authorized 3% annual increase that has been noted by Justin and myself. And I do want to point out that the agency does anticipate a need to seek your approval for additional 3% increases for calendar years 2021 and 2022 late during those years to help cover increasing costs. But those additional potential increases would be subject to future rulemaking proposals and are not included in these projected values. So with that, I'll hand it back to Justin for the final 3 slides of this presentation.
Thank you, Chair George. The first proposed change is really just a language clarification. We would be removing the term dairies from the fee tables section. This truly is just a housekeeping measure, just kind of clarifying what type of facilities pay what fees. It would not impact any individual fee payer or fee amounts. Next slide, please. And so this slide identifies what changes would occur to rule language depending on which option the EQC selects. If option one is selected, the rule language would not change. The fee tables would change. If option 2 is selected, rule language would be added, identifying the 2 phases of fee implementation. So generally, when we change our fees, it's the fee tables that are changing. If the option 1 is selected, the rule text doesn't change. But if option 2 is selected, we document that the 2-phase fee implementation in the rule language itself. Next slide, please. And so, In conclusion, DEQ recommends that the EQC select option 2, that the EQC adopt the proposed rules as seen in attachment B and the fee tables C and D of the staff report for this item as part of chapter 340 of the Oregon Administrative Rules, division 45 and 71. And that is the end of our presentation.
Justin, just to clarify, you walked through the two options and you started with the administrative clarification that it excludes those permits that are administered by the Department of Agriculture. So that first technical clarification is included in both option 1 and 2 and does not require a separate action. Is that correct?
Correct.
I thought so. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, as we proceed here, that we're getting both taken care of at the same time.
Appreciate the question, Chair George. Thank you.
All right, commissioners or director, if you have anything further to say, as we have two paths before us, I will welcome a discussion at this time. Commissioner Barrasso.
I just want to, there's a few slides back, you talked about that there's the economic relief. I just want to understand that doesn't exist now, but is that a proposal, and how would that be implemented? I just want to make sure I understand that.
I'd be happy to take that. Thank you, Vice Chair Barrasso. For the record, this is Ryan Huff. Just to be clear, the current administrative rules provide the authority for the director to provide installment plans or fee deferrals. Something that we actually do provide now. However, if one of these options is adopted by the commission, we anticipate taking a more proactive, aggressive marketing approach towards including notification in the invoices about this option, given the times that we're in. And similarly, the EQC authority to reduce or suspend the payments is also in current rule. This is something that has not been exercised, to my knowledge, in the recent past, but it's something that is provided for the commission to be able to reduce or suspend a payment based upon a permittee's economic hardship conditions. I anticipate the way this would have to work would be a petition to or a request to the commission by a specific entity, explaining the circumstances and seeking some reduction or termination of their fees. So hopefully that answers your question.
And this is Molly. I just want to follow up. That waiver deferral program, that exists regardless of option 1 and option 2.
Correct, Commissioner. This would be included in either of those options and be available under either of the options.
I appreciate that point, Commissioner Kyle. It's good to know that ability and the ability to make that request exists either way. So I think that is a good clarification.
If I might.
Commissioner Addington.
Justin, Ryan, I appreciate the presentation, and you know, this is challenging. I think the economics and what we're seeing with how COVID-19 is affecting, you know, everyone. That was my concern, is that we're putting a lot on people in a really tough time. That being said, I understand the need, and Justin, appreciate you pointing out that, you know, some of the small communities need some certainty to move forward with TMDLs and things like that. And so I appreciate the need for this and the need to get it done. I think the department heard us at the last meeting, at least some of the concerns about the amount of the increase. And I think this is, at least option 2 is really responsive to that. So I appreciate the work that went into this.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else?
So this is Molly again. In thinking between option 1 and option 2, I appreciated the side-by-side table showing what each option would and wouldn't do. the concerns still exist regarding the backlog, as well as pulling people from one side of the program to the other to address the backlog. And so I guess my question to the agency really is, option 2 would not hire for permit writers, so, or for positions. How would, and you kind of charted out what that would mean for reducing the backlog and getting the work done that needs to get done. But I don't recall in that slide, or if you had it, I missed it, what the different 2 options would mean with regards to getting the program solid and sustainable. Like, how critical are those 4 positions, I guess, is part of what I'm asking.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Kyle. And then Ryan may want to add some clarification to exactly what positions we're talking about. What I'm understanding your question as, what would be the impact on our work between option 1 and option 2? If that's the question, it would definitely impact the the timing of our work. It's essentially a year delay where we have less resources to work on permit development. 2 of the 4 positions, 2 are individual permit development positions. One's a general permit development position, and 1 is a compliance assurance position. So that's a compliance professional. So there would be impacts to the program and our ability to continue the progress that we're very proud of. But looking at the options that are out there and the conditions that are in with COVID, this would be a delay in the work that we're doing with the selection of option 2. But the real important part for us is that showing that how important these positions are to the near-term and long-term success of the permitting program.
Director Whitman.
Yeah, thank you. So to be specific, it would be a 1-year delay in the hiring of those 4 positions that Justin just explained. Again, there's a stormwater, there's a general permit position, 2 individual permit positions, and then a compliance position that would be delayed for a 1-year period. That's the difference between option 1 and option 2. We're not saying we would never hire those positions. We're just doing a 1-year delay. That's what the difference is between the options.
Thank you. That helps with the clarification.
Yes, thank you both. All right, commissioners. Well, we are presented with some options here. Do one of the commissioners wish to make either to open the floor to discussion about these 2 options, or is somebody prepared to make a motion, or we will entertain either? Commissioner Mosby.
Yeah, Chair, again, I hear everything we've said. I think that we haven't seen the worst yet. And so I'm prepared to make a motion on option 2. I move that the Environmental Quality Commission adopt the proposed rules as seen in Attachment B and the accompanying fee tables in Attachment C and Attachment D of the staff report for this item as part of Chapter 340, the Oregon Administrative Rules Division 45.
Do we have a second in support of option 2?
This is Commissioner Kyle. I second.
Okay, motion's been made and seconded. And for clarity, we will have a roll call vote. Vice Chair Barrasso.
Aye.
Commissioner Mosby.
Aye.
Commissioner Kyle.
Aye.
Commissioner Addington.
Aye.
The motion passes. I want to thank everybody who's participated in this. I also want to thank the commissioners for the really good dialogue that's occurred around this. And I want to thank the department for being really very responsive to the issues that were raised. the need to move forward with this important work, and also the recognition that these are very difficult times for our communities. So really, thank you everyone for hearing that need and for responding and bringing some very good options to the table. All right, friends, we are moving along. We are a little bit behind schedule, but we had some very important discussions. And I do think probably everybody needs to stretch and move around a little bit. It is now 3:21. Why don't we come back and come back together at 3:30? Does that work for everyone? Excellent. We'll see you here at 3:30. Online. And our recording is back on. All right, I think we have all returned. And so we will resume with our next agenda item, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Program update. Richard and Colin.
Yes, thank you, Chair George and Commissioners. For the record, this is Richard Whitman, and you heard from Leah Felden a little bit earlier about some of the operational limitations that we're at with the COVID pandemic, and now you're going to get to see them firsthand. You have Colin and I together, but and we're more than 6 feet apart, but out of an abundance of caution, we're going to try to do this masked. We wanted to be in the same room together for this presentation so that we could coordinate effectively. But I'm going to kick it off and then turn it over to Colin McConaughey, who is the manager for our Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs at DEQ. And for the record, I'm DEQ's director. Stephanie, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so I wanted to start out this presentation by giving the Commission an overview of what Oregon is already doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Oregon actually was one of the first states in the nation to begin working on greenhouse gas reduction back in the mid-1990s when Oregon's Energy Facility Siting Council adopted a carbon dioxide standard for new electric generation facilities. But since that time, there's been significant other work, including here at DEQ. We have our zero emission vehicle, low emission vehicle program where we adopt California's standards for clean cars. We have the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program that was authorized by the legislature a couple of years ago that extends until 2023, that is now in full swing. We have the Clean Fuels Program that also commenced in 2015 and is currently operational through 2025. We're going to talk about an extension of that program. Colin is going to in a minute. We have an employee commute option program, which works with large employers in the Portland metro area who have more than 100 people at a particular work site to incentivize ways of getting to and from work other than single occupancy vehicles. So those are all existing greenhouse gas programs at Oregon DEQ. Then there are also existing programs at other state agencies. At our the state's Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Oregon Department of Transportation have really since 2007 worked actively to reduce vehicle miles traveled, again, the use of cars, particularly for passenger vehicles. And that's done in part through our our statewide land use planning program, but also through programs at the Oregon Department of Transportation. I've already mentioned the Energy Facility Siting Council and the standard for new electric generation facilities. That's again been in place now for almost 25 years, and is a number of natural gas plants that have been built during that period have all been subject to that standard. A big important piece for Oregon is our renewable portfolio standard, overseen by Oregon Public Utilities Commission, that aims to have 50% of our electric generation be renewable by 2040. Thank you, Colin. And then more recently, the Oregon legislature and utilities agreed on a coal to clean program, which will phase out the use or consumption of electricity that is generated from burning coal in Oregon by 2030. And then finally, and really fundamental to a lot of this work, is a reporting program for greenhouse gas emissions that was set up here at Oregon DEQ, and that is you recently adopted rules that supplement that program. And it's foundational because, again, we can't control something until we see it. And so having that reporting, understanding what the current status is and trends are in greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon is really critical to bringing those emissions down over time. So this is just a quick snapshot of the existing programs. I'm sure I probably left out some programs that also have some benefit in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. I could mention Energy Trust of Oregon and other energy efficiency programs that are important as well. We have appliance standards, we have building codes, but this just gives you a brief picture of some of the more important programs. So next slide, Stephanie. Thank you. So again, a lot of information on this slide. These are the new or expanded programs at DEQ under Governor Brown's Executive Order 20-04. The executive order that was issued in March of this year after the legislature once again failed to adopt comprehensive greenhouse gas reduction legislation. So first in mid-May and then at the end of June, we submitted a report to Governor Brown detailing our work plan for these programs. Colin is going to talk about the cap and reduce programs and the clean fuels program extension. I'm going to talk very briefly about the statewide transportation strategy and programs to reduce methane emissions from landfills. But this just puts it all in one place so you can see the, in some ways, the complexity of what we have before us in terms of policy development and then ultimately implementation to really put Oregon on track to meeting greenhouse gas reduction goals, including legislative goals that have been in place since 2007. So let me pause there before I turn it over to Colin and just see if there are any questions from commissioners before I do turn it over to Colin.
Doesn't look like we have any at this time.
Great. Okay. So Colin.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Chair George, members of the commission, for the record, my name is Colin McConaughey. I'm the manager of the Office of Greenhouse Gas Programs here at DEQ. And Stephanie, if we could advance to the next slide, please. As Richard already mentioned, I'm going to cover just two of the many directives in the governor's executive order. They happen to be two fairly significant directives to us in the areas of our clean fuels program and a new program or set of programs to cap and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the key sectors that Richard's previous table mentioned. Stephanie, next slide. Great, thank you. So the first directive in the order to DEQ is to expand and extend the Clean Fuels program, I would say very significantly. And to give you some context, I'll just remind you of the current program and its current state. It began operation in 2015 and is scoped to reduce the life cycle carbon intensity associated with the transportation fuels supplied in Oregon over 10 years. So 10% reduction in the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation fuels over 10 years. That's being phased in, and we're now at the halfway point. So that's the current program. Now contrast that with the new directive in the governor's executive order is quite ambitious. It is to, so the current program will be achieved by 2025. The new directive is for that program to be expanded to achieve another 10% reduction in just 5 years by 2030. So doubling the reduction in half as much time, just to show the ambition there. And then going further still to 25% by 2035. And I'll just note that that's more ambitious than any current jurisdiction has adopted. In fact, I think it was just this week or quite recently, British Columbia, one of the several jurisdictions with a low carbon fuel standard like our Clean Fuels program, just adopted a new expansion to their program to be 20%. So I'm not aware of any current jurisdiction going quite so far as 25% yet. And actually, there's a second Clean Fuels directive that I'll describe as well, which is narrowly focused, directing the agency and our commission to explore specific opportunities within the Clean Fuels program to further incentivize the transportation electrification and further hasten that transition. And I'll explain that more in just a minute. Stephanie, next slide, please. Okay, so I'll pause here and describe. This is a schedule we've actually shown you once before, highlighting several key steps in the next couple of years that we will be taking to meet those two directives. And actually, I'll start with that electricity directive. We're already beginning work on that. Just yesterday, in fact, we held a meeting with a wide variety of stakeholders in the electric sector, utilities, and other types of stakeholders to brainstorm on ideas for ways we could change the way the Clean Fuels program works to further incentivize transportation electrification. And the reason for moving quickly and separately on this rulemaking is so that we can get those changes in place as soon as possible so that those additional credit generating opportunities under the program happen quickly. So that's an ambitious but yet narrowly scoped rulemaking that we have planned to really, we're just getting underway now, and with the planned proposal to be submitted to EQC in time for deliberation at your March meeting next year. And then the other rows in this chart that you see are all connected to how we are going to, the lead up to and through rulemaking to meet that expansion directive. And because we have time here, the program's already, as I say, scoped out through 2025. We want to take a real deliberative and stepwise process with our stakeholders and with the public, and also because of the ambition of that directive, take our time to figure out how best to expand the program. It's not as simple as just swapping out a couple numbers and dates. We believe there's going to be some significant changes needed for the program to be able to meet those ambitious targets. And so to start with, we are currently in the contracting process to set up two separate studies. The first is something that the program did at its outset, or very similar to what we did at the outset of this program several years ago, which is to study various scenarios in which Oregon's transportation fuels market transforms to hit that ultimately that 25% by 2035 target. So what additional types of biofuels and electrification in the transportation sector would need to happen? And because this program is, we say it's fuels agnostic, meaning it doesn't pick particular types of biofuels or electricity as the path forward. We'll have multiple scenarios, some showing more heavy electrification, others more renewable natural gas or biofuels. and we'll work with stakeholders to evaluate the realism of some of those scenarios, and how the fuels market around our state and in our state could feasibly hit some of those scenarios. Then the second study going on in parallel that I'm real excited about will be evaluating those scenarios for their tailpipe pollution implications. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a life cycle program. It looks at the life cycle carbon intensity of these fuels. In this case, though, we want to specifically look at the final stage of that life cycle, the combustion in a vehicle and the tailpipe pollution that results, and look at how the changes in tailpipe pollution from those various scenarios, showing how we would hit 25% by 2035, looking at the doing some exposure modeling and evaluating how the changes in tailpipe emissions would affect public health here in Oregon, and also further defining the economic value of the health benefits. Once we've done those studies, then actually we're going to conduct what we call, actually what legislature calls a program review. This is something the legislature requires of us to do, not in the time frame shown here. It's actually not required necessarily until 2022, but we want to begin this early to inform the subsequent rulemaking process. And this is something legislature required of us in a 2017 rulemaking that they adopted, introduced a variety of changes to the Clean Fuels program. And this is intended really kind of as a midway or a little bit further into the program, evaluation of the program. How is it operating? Are we on track to achieve the current goal? What are the health and economic and environmental implications of the program so far? And recommend, if we identify them, changes that could or should be made to improve the efficacy of the program and the cost effectiveness of the program. So we'll do that early in the middle of next year to inform then a subsequent rulemaking process that we have scoped to last for about a year and be proposed to EQC for consideration by the middle of 2022. Stephanie, next slide, please. Okay, so that was my description of the processes underway or plan to be underway to meet the governor's directives to expand and improve the Clean Fuels program. I'm going to transition now to another directive, which I've spoken with the commission in the past about, which is the directive to cap and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from certain sectors. And those sectors include large stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions, transportation fuels, including gasoline and diesel, as well as all other liquid and gaseous fuels, including natural gas. So that's a broad swath of Oregon's economy, not all of it, but as we typically account for emissions in Oregon, this we believe would cover more than half of the emissions in Oregon. And as you may also recall, the order directs us to report back to the governor on how we think we're going to be able to develop these programs to cap and reduce emissions in those sectors. We submitted a preliminary report on May 15th, actually kicked off a public comment period for the following month, received those comments, and those informed then revisions we made to the report and submitted that June 30th. Stephanie, next slide, please.
Vice Chair Barrasso.
Colin, thank you for this. It reminds me, and this is, I know you've answered this before, and I'll just ask it again, but remind me what, with the plan around clean fuels, explain sort of the purpose of I understand the purpose of clean fuels. I get what's happening there. I can understand that. Why is transportation fuels also called out within the sector specific cap? What gap is being addressed by bringing in under this approach as well? Or is there something, I just want to make sure I understand, because I understand what's happening in clean fuels. I understand that's targeted at transportation fuels, agnostic in terms of the specific fuel itself. It's the market, but what's the difference here?
Yeah, Chair George, Commissioner Barrasso, that is a really good question, and it's not one I've answered simply in the past anyway. I think the reason for inclusion of transportation fuels is that is our largest source of emissions, and it is also a sector that is trending in the wrong direction, if you will, where other sectors are staying flat or even going down. Transportation has been creeping up in recent years and remains, again, our largest source. So I think the intent is to double down and make sure We don't let those emissions escape from this cap and reduce area either, but that we're absolutely going to have to figure out how we design this program to be complementary and stack atop the clean fuels program or beneath, whatever order you want to think of it in, and that those two complement one another rather than duplicate one another.
If I could, Chair George, Commissioner Barrasso, just add a little bit to that. Another way of saying essentially the same thing that Colin just said is the Clean Fuels Program will get us partway to meeting the overall GHG reductions that both the legislature and the governor have asked us to get to. But the Clean Fuels Program really addresses only one of the levers, if you will, that influences overall GHG emissions from transportation. We also have to look at the amount that people are driving the vehicles that consume those fuels. And then also there's just how people and goods are getting around and the extent to which people are driving, and also the extent to which other modes of transportation, whether that's trucks or rail or marine, also are being used in the state. So in order to get to reductions in the transportation sector, we actually need to be addressing each of those segments, if you will. So clean fuels is an extremely important part of that puzzle, but it's not the only piece.
Thank you.
Yep. That helped.
And I'll ask this again, inevitably.
Yep.
Well, and Chair George, Commissioner Barrasso, I will say, as we go through the development process, which I'm going to outline here in the next couple slides, I think we'll have more informed answers as to how this program is going to work in that sector with the Clean Fuels Program operating at the same time. So yes, I think asking in the future and seeking our answers as we go along would be well received, speaking for myself anyway. So, okay, this is just a quick slide here on the process that we've scoped out in those reports to the governor's office. And actually we're through phase one, which we said was a period of time where we engaged the public on the subsequent process that we were outlining for how to develop these cap and reduce programs. Which, and upon submittal of that final report on June 30th, we've now said we're entering the second phase, which is not yet a rulemaking phase. It's a pre-rulemaking phase we call the scoping period, where we engage the public and stakeholders now not on process, but actually on the design of the program itself, how it should be set up. We'll be, and I'll mention in more detail here in the next couple of slides about what this scoping phase will entail, but also we know that then following that, this will be this phase will last throughout the summer and fall, and then near the end of the year, we'll begin that formal rulemaking phase. Yeah.
If I could, again, Chair George, I want to talk just a little bit about the environmental justice piece of this, because that was something that was really emphasized back in March in Governor Brown's executive order, asking all the agencies working on programs under the executive order to really put a focus on their thinking and policy development work, to think about how to work with communities that have been disproportionately affected by climate and pollution in the past. So we have had some informal outreach and engagement with some in the environmental justice community, but we have more work to do there. And obviously with both the COVID pandemic and the disproportionate effects that the pandemic is having on communities of color, and also the economic effects of the pandemic, together with all that we've seen about racial justice in the George Floyd killing here in the last couple of months, is really put a focus on this work around environmental justice and climate justice specifically, both in terms of process and how we bring those communities into decision-making and policy development, and in terms of analysis and how we, as part of our policy development process and part of what we bring to you ultimately, information about how these policies may help or hurt those communities, particularly in light of the cumulative burden that those communities have felt from pollution historically. So this is something that we're taking very seriously. I know other agencies are as well. We continue to get direction from Governor Brown about the importance of this also as part of this effort. So I really wanted to emphasize that piece of it, and this is still very much a developing conversation with those communities and representatives in those communities.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Stephanie, if we can go to the next slide, please. This is just outlining that process in a little more detail, noting, I'll draw particular attention to actually the first part, since that's the part we're beginning now. This is that scoping phase I mentioned. We've actually planned now and scheduled and noticed a public kickoff meeting to be held on the afternoon of July 29th. And that is our first chance to really engage the public and our stakeholders with the broad question of, okay, how should we be considering designing this program or multiple programs, as well as to raise awareness and provide more information about the subsequent processes in that phase. And those entail a variety of technical workshops, and I'll describe those more on the next slide. That'll be happening throughout August and into September. And then some subsequent and those technical workshops will be designed to dig into specific parts of how a cap and reduce program can work. And again, I'll mention more here on the next slide, and getting feedback from stakeholders about how that is to work or should work, and knowing that we'll get a lot of different and sometimes competing ideas about how those different parts of the program should work. And then we take a little bit of a break, hopefully at least a couple of weeks, for us to deliberate and consider all that different input on in those different areas, and distill and take that back out to the public for town hall style meetings, where we are rolling out the input that we received as well, and then soliciting broader public input on that and on the overall program as well. And then in the fall, we will be updating the commission again on the progress and the information we received at those workshops and at those town hall style meetings. And then the rest of the slide really shows the typical rulemaking process, where we will, EQC, we will need to appoint our Rules Advisory Committee. We'll need to bring information to that committee through a series of meetings, undoubtedly receive input from the committee, as well as produce and review a fiscal impact statement. After which, as you know, we then hold a public comment process, hold public hearings, take written comments, and ultimately develop a proposal for EQC to consider and deliberate and make a decision on. And that's scoped out through the end of next year. Stephanie, next slide. All right, so I wanted to give a little more detail on what's coming up here next month and the month after, which is primarily these technical workshops. And this is not locked in yet, but right now, as we're thinking about it, we've identified 6 different areas that are both distinct, have some pretty distinct considerations, but understanding that all of these are at some level or another are linked to one another. But nonetheless, the program like this is so big and has so many different parts to it. We identified the need to have these topic-specific technical workshops, again, August and into September. And I'll just walk you through these. Again, these are not locked in yet, but what we're thinking about right now is the 6 topics you see before you. And the first of which is probably the most foundational, which is the scope of the program, which is simply which greenhouse gases should this program cover. As you well know, I'm sure there are more greenhouse gases than simply carbon dioxide. Which of those should the program cover? What emission sources of those greenhouse gases should be covered, and then what entities should be responsible for those emissions? So that's what we mean when we talk about scope. And as you can imagine, there's probably a lot of different ideas and answers to those questions. And I'll note, you'll see that these all are in the form of questions. These are questions from us being teed up with stakeholders to have a conversation about how they think these questions should or could be answered. The next one, and these are in no particular order, although I think scope is perhaps the most foundational. And that is the second one being stringency. Ultimately, this is we talked about this being a cap and reduce program. Well, once you've determined what emissions are covered and who's responsible for them and set up an initial cap, when you subsequently reduce that cap, how fast that reduction happens, that's the stringency of the program. And again, I think you can imagine there's going to be a lot of different thoughts, opinions, and concerns about how the stringency of the program is designed. The next one shown here is impacted communities. Richard mentioned this earlier. We want to have, this touches on all parts of the program design, but we wanted to have a space to talk specifically with members of these communities. These are communities that have lower incomes, higher minority populations, and are unfortunately often what I refer to as frontline communities, meaning they are at the front lines of feeling and facing the effects of climate change already and into the future, and wanting to be especially mindful of how this program can be designed to protect those communities, what strategies we might be able to employ to avoid or mitigate potential negative impacts of this program or of climate reduction programs elsewhere in the state, and also really hear the priorities from these communities about what they'd like to see a program like this operate. The next one that's shown there is demonstrating compliance, which was really a phrase we may work on a little bit, but what we mean by that is essentially how should this program issue permits or compliance instruments to whom and on what basis, and knowing that there's a lot of considerations for how a program like this issues those permits to emit greenhouse gases from within the overall cap or budget, if you will. Some of those concerns are about leakage, which means a program like this can inadvertently have the negative consequence of simply shifting emission sources out of Oregon. So not actually reducing emissions overall, but moving them out of the state where those emissions are less regulated. As well as when you start issuing permits into these broad sectors of Oregon's economy, you have to be aware of existing markets that exist and not disrupting them, or if you are changing how those existing markets operate, knowing how you're making that change and being comfortable with that. Second to last here, we call is titled Alternative Compliance Options. And this is to consider what, if any, alternative mechanisms would be afforded entities to comply with the program aside from, say, directly issued permits from DEQ. Should those compliance options come from existing programs like carbon offsets, or should there be specific activities or investments that this program identifies and awards credits to that are reducing greenhouse gases? And this would be to design, again, to tie connections here. The more flexibility and options you make available for compliance to entities, that connects back to possibly to that stringency topic I mentioned earlier, where the overall ambition or stringency of the program might be more realistically achieved at a higher stringency if we're also affording more flexibility for compliance in the program. And then finally, we've identified cost effectiveness as another key topic, and that would entail considerations such as trading. What, if any, amount of trading would we allow between entities within a sector, between entities in different sectors, and asking the question of what additional strategies could reduce economic burden on impacted communities and small businesses in particular. Stephanie, I think that's my last slide. So we can either pause here if there's questions of me, or we can move into Richard's next section on the statewide transportation strategy.
Commissioners, do you have any questions? Commissioner Addington.
I might be getting ahead of myself here.
Your background material, 2007.
Oops, I don't know what that was. I might be getting ahead of myself, but I'm trying to, I know there's budget implications to all of this, but how do we know what that is? I mean, what is this going to cost, and how? I'm having a hard time of thinking about this in context of, the agency's sort of core mission and where this fits in. Richard, I'm sort of rambling, I know, but can you help me with that at all?
Sure, I'm happy to help you, Greg, Commissioner Addington, so I think you probably know over the last year there was been a fair amount of conversation about just if we're going to have a program like this, where should it be housed in the state? And at one point there was some discussion about establishing a new state agency to administer this program. Really, for the last 9 months, that conversation has gone in the direction of housing this program at DEQ. And let me tell you why, because it's, I think, responsive to your question. For the most part here, we are talking about regulating, this is a regulatory program, although market-based also. We are talking about regulating either facilities that emit pollution or uses that supply fuels that result in emissions. And for the most part, we're talking about regulation of entities that are already regulated to some degree by Oregon DEQ. So for the large, Colin described the 3 sectors of cap and reduce. For the large stationary sources, those are going to be facilities that already have an air permit from Oregon DEQ. The fuel suppliers, transportation fuel suppliers, are going to be entities that are already subject to Oregon's Clean Fuels program. And then the natural gas and other fuels, that is a new program or a new set of actors for DEQ in some sense, although they already report to Oregon DEQ in terms of some of their fuels. So there's a close correlation between the work required to implement this program and a lot of the base permitting work that DEQ already does. There will be cost of this program. The Oregon legislature has, after the governor issued her executive order, the legislature subsequently approved 10 positions for DEQ to do the policy development work for this program. But there will need to be a conversation about what does the long-term administration of this program look like and who pays for it, to what degree is it paid for out of fees. We do have authority to charge versus general fund or some other source of funding. So that is a conversation that I think is likely to occur in the 2021 legislative session, or that may occur there. So that's a partial answer to your question. We won't know until we get further into the policy development work exactly what it's going to take to operate this program, but we are looking largely at a market-based program similar in concept to the Clean Fuels program, where we've seen in that program really the ability to make significant reductions in carbon intensity of fuels, transportation fuels used in Oregon, with a very, very lean staff. So I'm hopeful that we can figure out similar efficiencies in terms of these cap and reduce programs that we've been charged with developing as well.
Commissioner Mosby?
Yeah, my question is, in the background material, Colin, you had a 2017 chart on greenhouse gas emissions, and no surprise, 40% were transportation based, 26%, you called it electric, I sort of call it utility based, 13% residential, 12 industrial, and 9% ag. My question is, have we ever done any correlation, and it sort of ties in with what Richard was saying, how we're going to pay for this. Right under that, you put climate equity and environmental justice as your next headline. To me, equity would be that the transportation sector should be paying 40% of DEQ's fees for this greenhouse gas, and should be close to those numbers, because that's where the problems are at. And my suspicion is, if we've ever looked at it, probably utilities and industrial have carried the burden on most of the DEQ fees for air emissions here. So just any comments there, and maybe Richard would say, you know, it's something we're going to look at, but I sort of believe in equity and social justice too, but it also should be for these sectors here.
Thank you, Chair George, Commissioner Mosby. This is Richard Whitman. I'll give a shot at answering your question. I think for the regulated communities, the DEQ fees should be the least of their concerns. If I'm a natural gas utility or a transportation fuel supplier or a large source, I think what they're going to be concerned about is under a cap and reduce program, if we are reducing the amount of their emissions by reducing their permitted emissions over time, are we going to be driving up the price of gasoline, the price of natural gas, the price of other fuels significantly through cap and reduce programs? And I think that's what people are most concerned about. And there are potential equity effects of that, both for transportation fuels if we're driving up gas prices, or in residential heating if we're driving up natural gas prices. So this is where having a suite of programs that drive reductions in emissions and not trying to do it all through supply and demand and just raising the price on fuels is really important for how we get this done and get it done in a way that doesn't really upset our economy or have effects on particularly lower income communities that just aren't acceptable. So having a clean fuels program, having energy efficiency programs for both residential and industrial users, looking at switching to some degree what fuels we use over to electricity and making our electricity lower carbon. Those are all the really critical ways, pathways to making this a success and not raising prices on gasoline, diesel, natural gas to a point that is unacceptable to Oregonians. That's a lot, that's a mouthful, but it was a very good question.
Okay, thank you. Let's continue.
All right, so I have the next slide, and so as I just said, you know, reducing those emissions in the transportation sector really is going to require a suite of programs, and that's what the statewide transportation strategy is about. This is an effort that was started back, I believe, in 2009 between these four agencies: ODOT, DLCD, Department of Energy, and DEQ. And there was a lot of analytical work that was done in the period 8 to 10 years ago, looking at what do we need to do to get to somewhere around a 60 to 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So a lot of analytical modeling work, particularly by ODOT. And that led to a selection of a set of strategies, a set of potential programs that was adopted in 2015 by ODOT and then approved by the Oregon Transportation Commission, I believe, in 2018. In the fall of 2019, Governor Brown asked these same four agencies to commit to developing a shared work plan for what's the low-hanging fruit that we're going to work on implementing first for the statewide transportation strategy. And then that ask that she made by letter in the fall of 2019 was essentially repeated in the Executive Order 20-04. So for the last 6 months, these 4 agencies have been meeting at both the commissioner, director, and staff level to develop a two-year work plan for what specific actions we're going to take to implement the SDS. And the focus has really been on actions that require more than one agency to be involved in the effort. If I could have the next slide, Stephanie. So let's see here. Yep. So again, and I alluded to this earlier, clean fuels are a large part of how we get to a reduction in transportation greenhouse gas emissions, but there are other legs to the stool. In particular, reducing the amount that is the amount that we drive, whether that be individual personal passenger vehicles or trucks. It also means cleaning up not just our fuels, but also our vehicles, our cars and our trucks. And it means also providing alternate modes to people to get around other than vehicles. So it's really all of those things. Next slide, please.
Actually, Richard, this is Molly.
Yeah.
On that last slide, some of this, and really what you're dealing with is systems, right? This is all going to require systems thinking and systems approaches to finding solutions. But when you're talking about reducing vehicle miles traveled per capita, how is the agency going to be working with the Department of Transportation and with equity considerations to try to get high quality mass transit in situations where that would perhaps achieve that goal versus kind of thinking about individual level effects? Because we really need to be working in partnership with other agencies. So I'm curious what that initial conversations are looking like.
Yeah, actually, Commissioner Kyle and Stephanie, if you could go to the next slide, I think that will help answer Commissioner Kyle's question a little bit. So I'll note the work in reducing the amount that we drive is really being led by the Department of Land Conservation and Development using our statewide land use planning system and the Oregon Department of Transportation. DEQ is really in a support role for that particular leg of the stool. You may recall I used to be DLCD director, so I do have some familiarity with this, having worked on it when this effort really started. But we have something in Oregon that gives us a tool and an advantage that really does not exist anywhere else in the nation, and that is our statewide land use planning program. In that program, there is something called the Transportation Planning Rule that already has within it an objective of reducing vehicle miles traveled by 10%. So that rule is being updated by the Policy Oversight Board for the Department of Land Conservation and Development, also known as Land Conservation and Development Commissioner, LCDC. That's one element of all this work. That TPR rule amendment will require our local partners to, in their land use plans, develop changes to their land use plans that are designed to reduce how much people have to drive. So what this comes down to is walkable communities where people are living closer to where they work, they're living closer to where they shop, they're living closer to their schools, to where they recreate. Those changes are not going to happen overnight. They're going to happen over a long period of time. So this is the leg of the stool that is really a long-term 20, 30, 40-year effort that also is going to require, in addition to regulation, public investment in transit, in bicycles and other modes of getting around. And when we think about this in terms of equity, we think about it in terms of the overall burden on households of housing cost and transportation cost, and really trying to plan our communities so that we're considering those costs together as part of a system that those households exist within, and we're trying to keep them, ideally reduce those costs for lower income communities over time. At the same time, we're reducing their need to rely on a vehicle. So again, there's a lot there. This could be a much longer conversation. We'd be happy to come back and talk about this piece more, but there's been a lot of work in Oregon in this arena already, and I'm really excited that DLCD and ODOT are taking on moving this forward, really the next step as part of this SDS effort. So Commissioner Kyle, did that sort of answer your question? Let me just check.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the fact that it is being looked at holistically like that across agencies, because I do, it's system-wide, right? It's about trying to find solutions, knowing that each community is a little bit different. And I get concerned perhaps a little bit when I see a goal being vehicle mile traveled reductions, because again, the need to travel by vehicle differs dramatically by where people live. So yes.
Yeah. What this looks like is going to be different in every single community. It's going to depend on the people living there and the existing physical layout of those communities, whether they're growing or not growing. And so I know that is something that is very much top of mind for both the LCD and ODOT as they take on this work. And everybody always has this impression that the statewide land use planning program is a one size fits all, is the term that's often thrown around, but that there is great care being taken to make this work for a wide range of communities in different circumstances. Okay, so just very briefly, again, these are some of the priority efforts. We've kind of talked about the GHG reduction planning effort. Related to that is transportation options. I haven't really talked about those yet, but DLCD will be looking at requirements, probably particularly in more urban communities, around parking. In part, again, there's an equity aspect to this. Right now, historically, communities and to some degree the state have encouraged or mandated parking around housing that has driven up the cost of that housing significantly. And so, again, there's an opportunity to rethink about how we encourage or discourage parking, both with regard to housing prices and with regard to encouraging or not encouraging use of single occupancy vehicles. There is a DEQ piece here, which is the statewide trip reduction policy. We have an eco rule in the Portland area right now that I mentioned briefly a little while ago. We are going to be asking the commission to consider potential expansion of that program to potentially other areas of the state where there is access to other ways of getting to and from work, and potentially to smaller work sites or employers in the Portland area as well. Clean fuels we've talked about already. We haven't talked a lot about transportation electrification. The only thing I really want to emphasize here is the new piece for us is really around freight and trucks. And looking at, the governor just signed a memorandum of understanding with 15 other states to implement California zero emission vehicle standards for medium and heavy duty trucks. that were just adopted by the California Air Resources Board. That's something that we're going to be bringing forward here in Oregon, ultimately to the Commission as well for your consideration. I didn't include the chart here, but the area that is really growing in terms of transportation GHG emissions is trucks. Passenger vehicle GHG emissions are pretty much flat right now in Oregon, but the freight sector is growing and to some degree accelerating. So really focusing tools on freight is a very important part of this effort in how we get to those reductions. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I have talked about all of these things already. Just very briefly on the last line there, the truck emission standards, in addition to the zero emissions vehicle requirements for medium and heavy duty trucks, we're also looking at low NOx standards that California is considering that are likely to be adopted by California kind of in parallel with their zero emission vehicle requirements. These are important standards because of the co-benefits of not just limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but also limiting the emissions that are really key in ozone and are driving part of the increases that we're seeing in ozone air pollution in our metro areas in Portland, Salem, Eugene, and Medford, as well as in California. And again, there is a significant equity component to that. The ozone and PM 2.5 emissions are particularly of concern along our major interstate corridors in urban areas. And again, a lot of that pollution burden right now is being driven by freight. All right, next slide, please. Last thing I want to say about this is just we recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the other three agencies committing us to this work and committing us to updating this work plan every 2 years. We're meeting regularly at the staff and director and probably continue to ask some commissioner involvement in this co-work as well. And so really excited to see the work between the agencies in this area. And then last slide, please, Stephanie. So for folks who are viewing this, this is just where you can get more information about some of the details of these different programs. This is the website for Oregon's greenhouse gas program webpage, as well as the Governor's Carbon Policy Office and ODOT's Every Mile Count webpage. The last thing I want to say about this is just in terms of commission involvement. As Colin mentioned, we do anticipate coming back to the commission in the fall for a update for what we've been hearing during the scoping process. We'll also be coming back to you to talk about the rules advisory committees and how they're set up, who is on them, how we are assuring appropriate representation from environmental justice organizations and others in the process. I think we're very committed to this being transparent, fair process. We know as we get into the details, it's going to get more controversial. So having it be transparent, having fairness, kind of level playing field in the Rules Advisory Committee is something that I know we're committed to at the staff level and would love to have input from the commission on as well. We are also thinking about potential involvement of a commissioner or two in the Rules Advisory Committee process that starts next year. I'll just note that in addition to the cap and reduce rulemaking, which is the main one that Colin described, about 6 months behind that will be the main clean fuels program rulemaking. There'll be an important rules advisory committee for that as well. And then smaller but still important rulemakings around the employee commute option program, the zero emission vehicle rulemaking for medium and heavy duty trucks. And I haven't talked about landfill methane here today, but another rulemaking there as well. I think the two main rulemakings where some level of commission involvement would probably be beneficial to us and to you would be the cap and reduce programs and probably the clean fuels program. So again, we'll be coming back and talking to you more about that, but this is something that is so significant that we're going to want to keep you closely informed about how this is progressing as it goes along, to make sure if there are options you want us to be looking at, that we're doing that, and that you're comfortable with the process that we're using to develop this important policy. And with that, I've gone over time. My apologies. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Commissioners, do you have any other questions at this time?
I guess I just want to acknowledge that this is certainly going to be a big body of work, and I've expressed my interest in this before, Richard, you directly, but it's a big body of work, and I think we're all aware of that, and not to understate that, but maybe to those listening, I just want to echo that, and it's gonna take time. So what you all have laid out there is a pretty aggressive. I think it's actually probably fairly aggressive as it is, and we'll have to think about how to both bring this in a way that's sustainable for the public that wants to engage in this process, and how we bring folks along, because there's a lot of complexity, a lot of layers to it, and I'd say you're going to need some skilled folks in helping you communicate all of this collectively. So as those recruitments get going, I wish you luck.
All right. Well, there's some words there, some foreshadowing from Vice Chair Barrasso. Anybody else?
So I just echo Sam's point. This is really important work. It's complex work, and it's long-term work, right? There's going to be some short-term actions perhaps, but we are also talking about things that are going to take a generation or more to really achieve the goals that we want to have. So it's really important work. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of cooperation and a lot of alignment of goals across agencies and across our citizenry. So I fully support it. I think it's wonderful work. I'm glad to see it's getting going. But it's I echo Sam's point. It's a lot, and it's complicated.
Definitely is. Anyone else? Thoughts for today? Okay, hearing none, I think that that is wrapping up our final presentation for today. But if you haven't had enough EQC yet, do not worry. We will be back tomorrow morning and finish up this agenda. Yes.
Chair George, I hesitate to say this, but there actually is one more agenda item for today.
Oh my goodness, there is indeed. Forgive me, everyone. Yeah, I was getting ahead of us, and I probably was looking at our time, which we've just gone a little bit over, but that's all right. We've had some very important conversations today. So I apologize, everyone. I was getting ahead of myself. We do have the focus on the diesel engine emissions work that has been done recently. So we will turn that over to the presentations for the diesel presentation.
Chair George, for the record, this is Matt Davis. I had planned to kick this off. I've been in the background talking with Stephanie, and I do want to raise the possibility with you and Director Whitman that Stephanie thinks we could start 30 minutes earlier tomorrow and adjust things if you all are kind of maxed out. We have a really dense presentation planned on this issue. And I just, it's your call. We can try and power through or.
All right, well, why don't we, I can see everybody here, commissioners, if you would prefer to proceed as scheduled and finish this last presentation today, please raise your hand so I can see it, and we'll see who wants to finish today. Commissioner Mosby, Commissioner Kyle. Oh, chair breaks the tie, huh? Oh, great. Oh, Commissioner Addington, you're in for just finishing up today and powering through?
I'm okay either way. Either way is fine.
Okay, let's do it, Matt. Let's finish out strong here with our last presentation of the day.
Great, and we'll try and be concise. So, good afternoon again. For the record, Matt Davis, Senior Legislative and Policy Analyst for the Air Quality Division. Eric Feely is also presenting with me. He'll introduce himself in a moment. So today is really the first in a series of informational briefings that we plan to bring you focused on diesel engine emissions. Our goal with the briefings is to provide a foundation on which the Commission can engage in policy conversations related to the issue. The department has a variety of rules and programs, most of which are mandated by the legislature and some of which you just heard about in the previous agenda item, they're going to require rulemaking from you all in the coming 18 months. And so our hope with these briefings is that it provides you all a comprehensive understanding of the science and the policy framework surrounding the issue so that you feel ready to engage in those rulemaking conversations. So as you can see on the slide here, diesel engines power a wide variety of vehicles and equipment that transport people, bring products to market, and do the heavy lifting of industry. They tend to be incredibly durable and power many facets of our economy. They also pollute. And today's briefing is designed to specifically cover topics related to that pollution. So we're going to present you a summary of the health effects associated with exposure to diesel engine exhaust with a focus on diesel particulate matter and briefly talk about some other environmental impacts. Next, we'll talk about what we know about the sources of diesel engine emissions in Oregon with a particular focus on a non-road engine emissions inventory study that's recently been completed. And then we'll share a little bit of information about the level of diesel particulate matter in the air throughout the state. And we'll end with kind of teeing up what we plan to talk about in the September briefing. So I would just flag here that today's briefing is really light or not at all about policy and program options, but kind of rest assured that that will be the focus of the September briefing. And we intentionally are trying to kind of break it up for you all, so it's kind of maybe a more manageable conversation. And then finally, before I turn it over to Eric, we're going to give you a snapshot of data today. And so I'm really going to be looking to you all to flag where there are areas that you need more or want more, where we did our best to identify the highlights, but one of the benefits I think of this briefing is to us to the department to hear from you all about what you want to learn more about and what additional information we can bring you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, Chair George, members of the Commission. For the record, my name is Eric Feely, Air Quality Planner and Clean Diesel Program Coordinator. So diesel engine exhaust is a complex mixture of gases and particles resulting from the combustion of diesel fuel. The exhaust is known to contain a wide variety of harmful and toxic substances, including nitrogen oxides, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs for short, which include compounds like naphthalene and benzoapyrene, and heavy metals like arsenic and chromium. In this slide, we are showing you how diesel particulates are formed on the left side, followed by a cross-section of a diesel particle on the right. We focus on the soot or particulate matter component of diesel engine exhaust because it is especially harmful to health. Decades of research identify particulate pollution as the #1 environmental health risk in the US emitted into the air. As you know, particulate matter comes from a variety of sources and is a criteria air pollutant. diesel particulate matter refers specifically to particulate matter associated with diesel fuel combustion in a diesel or compression ignition engine. Because DPM, for short, contains black carbon, toxins like metals, PAHs, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs tend to absorb to the surface of these particles. Once the particles enter the body, chemical reactions can occur that allow the release of the toxins from those particles. Next slide. In addition to absorption of toxics, the size of DPM makes it especially dangerous. The figure on the right illustrates a cross-section of a human hair, which is about 50 to 70 microns in diameter. DPM is a form of fine particulate matter of PM 2.5, meaning it is 2.5 microns in diameter or smaller. A majority of diesel soot is actually classified as ultrafine, meaning it is 0.1 microns or smaller. The ultrafine nature allows the particulates and the toxic substances attached to those particles to travel deep into the lungs, even crossing through the alveoli into the bloodstream. Diesel particulate matter is recognized as a Group 1 carcinogen by the International Agency on Cancer Research, specifically for lung cancer, and as likely carcinogenic to humans by EPA's Integrated Risk Information System. Oregon has long recognized diesel particulate matter as a carcinogen in our air toxics rules and programs. Aside from its carcinogenic properties, exposure to diesel particulate matter leads to increased asthma, especially among children, along with lung irritation and inflammation, blood clots, heart attacks, weakened immune systems, and long-term cognitive impacts, which can include reduced productivity, inability to concentrate, and dementia. Next slide. Another significant concern in Oregon is the diesel engine's contribution to ozone-forming precursors, such as NOx, as you heard from Richard a minute ago. As we discussed with you in other briefings, several airsheds, including Portland Metro and Medford, are experiencing increased levels of ozone in the summer months. Ozone is regulated by the EPA as a criteria air pollutant, meaning repeatedly exceeding the federal standards risks a non-attainment designation. Ozone is a secondary pollutant, meaning it forms through a photochemical process in the atmosphere. Ground level ozone, the pollutant regulated by EPA, can lead to a variety of respiratory related health impacts. Mobile sources are the most significant source of NOx emissions, and you can see on the figure, diesel exhaust accounts for approximately 45% of all mobile source emissions in Portland. Medford's source contribution is similar. Next slide. Now we're going to pivot to focus on what we know about diesel particulate emissions in Oregon. Most of the data we'll discuss relies on what is called an emissions inventory. An emissions inventory, or EI for short, is a tool used in air quality management to quantify the amount of emissions of a particular pollutant in a set geography over a certain period of time. Data is typically displayed by source or sector categories. It's important to note that an emission inventory in and of itself cannot quantify concentration of a pollutant in the air at a particular point of exposure. The most widely used inventory is what we call the National Emissions Inventory, or NEI for short. The NEI is a comprehensive and detailed estimate of emissions released into the air. The emissions include criteria pollutants, criteria precursors, and hazardous air pollutants, including diesel particulate matter from all anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic sources of air pollution. The NEI is released every 3 years based primarily upon data provided by state, local, and tribal air agencies for sources within their jurisdictions and supplemented by data developed by the EPA. This figure uses NEI data to illustrate how total diesel particulate matter emissions have changed over time in Oregon. While emissions have decreased over the last 20 years, the relative stagnation in the last 10 years is concerning, particularly because during that time, new trucks and equipment have become much cleaner. Starting in 2007, federal regulations required particulate emissions from new engines to be roughly 90% lower than those manufactured just a year earlier in 2006. Next slide, please. 2017 is the most recent NEI data set we have. This figure shows the relative source contribution of that diesel particulate matter at the statewide level. As you can see, mobile sources, both on-road and non-road, are responsible for the vast majority of DPM emissions in the state. It's important to note, however, that any one individual's exposure and the sources responsible for that exposure is highly dependent on their local environment and daily life. For example, stationary sources account for a very small amount of statewide emissions, but can pose significant risk for those who live near a commercial scale diesel generator that operates regularly to provide backup power. And I just want to note that you won't see diesel generators in this pie chart because they account for actually a very small percentage of the pie. It's 0.45 tons or much less than 1%. The next few slides provide a more detailed look at specific slices of this pie and detail a recent study assessing non-road emissions specifically. Next slide, please. Going into a bit more detail, this figure shows the breakdown of the on-road slice of that pie from the previous slide, which primarily comes from heavy-duty vehicles. And that's about 87%. Now, as mentioned earlier, not all diesel particulate emissions are created equal. For example, and here I'm foreshadowing what's going to come in the fall, in the chart, you can see that school buses account for 6% of the inventory, which is in the darker blue. However, because children are a particularly sensitive population, the agency has directed a larger percentage of its available grant funding to reduce particulate emissions from those vehicles. An important point to emphasize here is that these heavy on-road vehicles can remain in use for up to 20 years or more, as we will see on the next slide. This data illustrates the age distribution of heavy-duty trucks in Oregon, based on data from ODOT's Motor Carrier Division. A note here that heavy-duty trucks in this context are greater than those that are 26,000 pounds or more, and you can see examples of these type of vehicles in the graphic. Heavy-duty trucks are registered differently than your personal passenger vehicles. These trucks fall into one of three categories. The first is trucks that drive into or through Oregon as part of their route. The second, trucks that are based in Oregon but travel outside of the state regularly. And the last category, trucks that are based in Oregon and only travel within the state. In this figure, the orange bars represent trucks in the first category, trucks that drive into or through the state but are not based here. You can think of these trucks that run long haul as trucks that run long haul interstate routes. The blue bars represent trucks in the second two categories, which are Oregon-based trucks. There are a few takeaways. The first is obvious. Trucks from out of state account for the vast majority of heavy-duty trucks that register within Oregon. This category of trucks also tends to be newer. Most trucks in this category are newer than model year 2011, which is a significant year in terms of emission standards. However, this chart doesn't reflect which category accounts for the most miles driven in the state. That's important because diesel emissions are directly related to the amount of fuel burned, which in turn is directly related to the number of miles driven. You can also see that compared to non-Oregon-based trucks, the age distribution of Oregon-based trucks is not as skewed toward newer model years, meaning that Oregon-based trucks tend to be proportionally older. Next slide. Let's move on to the non-road category of diesel particulate emissions. That is the orange slice that you see here, representing 32% of the DPM emitted into the air across the state. In 2017, DEQ was directed by the legislature to secure a contractor to conduct a multi-sector inventory of non-road diesel engines in use in Oregon. The primary purpose being to improve upon EPA default inputs, in turn improving the accuracy of air quality modeling results. In addition, better characterization of fleets, for example, the age of the equipment, the amount of usage of that equipment, the location of use of that equipment, across different sectors could reveal where incentive programs would have the most impact on emissions reductions. Next slide. Let's briefly discuss the study data collection methods before we move on to the findings. There were 3 approaches to collecting the required data. The first approach were whole fleet surveys that were used for the public sector. These were cities and counties, state and federal agencies, etc. These attempted to capture detail on every vehicle in operation in each of those fleets. Then there were random sample surveys that were used in sectors that had large numbers of businesses or business locations like agriculture, logging, and surface mining. The third category were industry-specific profiles, and these were developed in sectors with a wide variety of project types and equipment usage patterns. Industry profiles required putting an industrial task list together and estimating equipment productivity. These profiles relied heavily on industry experts in Oregon. For these sectors, emissions were determined based on equipment hours of use and engine age distribution. Next slide. Now we're going to move on to the findings. Overall, this study found particulate and NOx emissions from non-road sources is similar to what we expected from the 2017 National Emissions Inventory at the statewide level. However, there are differences in key sectors like construction and logging. What you are seeing on this chart is a comparison between diesel particulate matter emissions from the statewide study, which are the orange bars, and the results that would have normally been generated using the EPA default values for equipment numbers. And those are the black bars. Total statewide DPM emissions are compared on the leftmost bars, and those totals are broken out by sector as you move toward the right. You can see that agriculture is the largest statewide source of diesel particulate emissions, followed by construction activity. Another important finding is that the relative source contributions to emissions vary substantially between counties. For example, construction is the largest source for Multnomah County. Logging is the largest source for Lane County, and agriculture the largest for Klamath, and on and on. Next slide. Another important finding is that in several sectors, as seen on the screen, Oregon has much older fleets than what the EPA MOVES model assumes. As we've alluded to, the age or tier of the engine is directly related to its emissions profile. Older engines being higher emitting. On the one hand, that's something that Oregon can be proud of. We take care of and we maintain our equipment. On the other hand, older equipment staying in use for decades delays our progress towards reducing emissions to acceptable levels. Next slide, and now I'll turn it back over to Matt Davis.
Vice Chair Barrasso. Sam, I think you're on mute.
I just want to make sure on the slide, tier 4, Eric, is those are new, are tier 4 the newer vehicles?
Chair George, Commissioner Barrasso, yes, the tier 4 are the newest vehicles, the tier 0 are the oldest. So what you can see are that, for example, the study showed that in logging, there was just about over 20% of the oldest engines, where the typical EPA model showed that there were pretty much none. So that's the same through agricultural and construction as well.
Got it. And in the previous slide, you showed sort of the difference overall in terms of I guess this is the emissions by equipment. And I get this is for non-road, so it looks like we have lower overall non-road emissions based on the study than the EPA model. Does that change the percentage of emissions associated, the percentage contributing to the percentage between on-road and non-road? I know that, or did we not really get any, I mean, did we get no real new data on-road? I know there's always been these percentage breakdowns of what percentage of emissions come from on-road and off-road diesel, and I don't want to, if you're going to go there, let me not, but if you're already, yeah, but I wanted to ask if this at all informs that or changes that.
Chair George, Commissioner Barrasso, this was only focused on non-road. I will say that in 2017, and this was maybe only a few months ago, we did have the release of the most recent national emissions inventory. So we have the newest information on on-road fleets and on-road emissions, but that was not part of this study. So, and the national emissions inventory did not take into consideration this data set. This was a separate standalone study.
And Commissioner Mosby.
Yes, Eric, can we go back to slide 8 real quick? And the question when we get there is USO transit bus 1%, USO intercity bus 11%. Now, Greyhound, there are intercity buses, but are we, as TriMet, since it goes through 3 counties, is that considered an intercity bus? What? That seems odd to me. I would have thought transit would have been higher than intercity.
Chair George, Commissioner Mosby, I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest. I haven't dived down deep into what the defined categories are from the National Emissions Inventory on this particular category, but I do agree that it is interesting that transit bus and intercity bus are so dramatically different, and we can investigate that and get back with you.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Addington.
And if you may have already said this, I'm sorry if I missed it. On slides 12 and 13, when I'm looking at the Oregon study versus the EPA moves model, is the EPA model a national average kind of thing, or is that an Oregon specific model?
Chair George, Commissioner Addington, there is specific Oregon data that's used in the moves model, but it's informed by national averages. So, for example, there might be economic factors or economic indicators that are used as a surrogate, but it's not equipment counts like we did with this bottom-up survey. So it might look at, for example, the amount of construction dollars that are spent in Oregon, right? So it might be specific to Oregon in that regard, but it's not necessarily specific to equipment counts or the age of the equipment, right? So the assumptions that EPA might make would be national averages when it comes to the tiers in the next slide. So yeah, in this case, that's definitely national averages. And so that's why you see they're so skewed, just because Oregon tends to keep its equipment around longer. But so it's sort of a mixture. There's some Oregon specific information, but other pieces of information are averaged nationally.
Okay, thank you.
And this is Molly. I kind of had a question to follow up on that because we've been hearing a lot about the potential for older diesel engines in California that no longer meet their emission standards being sold up here into Oregon. So when I was kind of reading through the report and saw the age of the vehicles as one of the variables that they were collecting in their survey, and then this finding, I was trying to, was there, I guess the specific question is, was there information captured that would address that kind of question about Oregon receiving the older, dirtier diesel engines from the neighborhoods in these different categories? Because I couldn't really parse it out of the report.
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, there was no attempt to sort of quantify or get a number or even investigate the origin of this equipment, like where it was originally purchased or where it was originally located before it moved to Oregon. Okay. Having said that, there is, of course, anecdotal information by my predecessor. I've seen, pictures that have been taken across the state that, indicate that a piece of equipment likely came from California because it has a very identifiable California emissions label on it, right? So these are fairly obvious, really large red and green stickers that are on these pieces of equipment. And so, anecdotally, I think you could say that that definitely happens. To what extent, we can't say, and this study did not reveal that.
Okay. So I guess kind of the question I have then is on the interpretation, because it was very interesting to see the age of the different fleets and in the different sectors. But if we're saying that, or the move, especially when it comes to interpreting the moves model versus Oregon, if we're trying to say that the moves model underestimates Oregon because of the age of the vehicle fleet, because Oregon holds onto its vehicles longer, we actually, that last clause may be a little mix up between we hold onto our vehicles longer, and we've also been the unfortunate recipients of a neighbor state policy.
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, it's hard for me to respond to that. I think that there, you know, yes, that might be part of the reason that it may not be just that we're holding on to our equipment longer. I just, you know, that's again, could just be anecdotal. But the thing is, these pieces of equipment can stay around for 30 years. And that's the main issue, is that, you know, how do you push the age of the fleet in a younger direction when the oldest pieces of equipment are the most polluting? If you can keep these vehicles running for, you know, a long period of time, that's a challenge. And you have to, you know, really work on incentives programs, which we'll talk about in the fall. But, you know, that's part of what this study was designed to do, is to give us an understanding of, you know, where we might want to focus our incentive programs.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the question that when I read through the report, or kind of just breezed through the report, because I need to go back and digest the details a little bit more, the use of this information. And it sounds like that will be how we use this to prioritize incentive programs as part of it. But I was curious if in the fall, we're also going to be talking about some of that disconnect between neighboring state policies, because if we are always the easier state to sell things in, we won't necessarily be able to correct that issue. So it's a little bit about maybe harmonizing some of these diesel emission standards between states, and if there's going to be conversations about that as we discuss policies.
Chair George, Commissioner Kyle, yeah, I think you heard Director Whitman mention some of that harmonization on the on-road sector. For non-road, it might be more of a challenge just based on our authority and what we could do in that sector. It's just a little bit more complicated. It's unclear to me whether we would ever be able to prevent those kind of interstate sales. You know, and we haven't done the investigation that would give us real numbers on that, real data on that. You know, at this point, it's just anecdotal. So having said that, I do want to just emphasize that for the case of on-road, you know, some of the vehicles that will be sold up here may be, you know, may have particulate reductions on them, which would be good. So what I'm saying is you might get some sort of newer, older vehicles that come from California, right? So not the oldest type, but because California is so far ahead of us on the on-road side for heavy duty, we might get the vehicles that have, you know, that they're kicking out of their state that have particulate controls, which is the primary concern. Of course, NOx is definitely still a concern, but the primary concern for the longest time in Oregon has been the air toxics associated with particulate, which Matt will get to next.
So Commissioner Kyle, if I might just kind of wrap up that conversation in a way that tees up for September. We know older equipment and trucks are leaving California because they have incredibly aggressive standards for in-use engines, and they're seeing those standards being complied with. I think the question that's more difficult to answer is, where are they going? No other state has California-like standards. I think there's a, you know, as Eric was saying, there's a risk that we're mindful of, being a state that directly neighbors California. For non-road, we don't require registration of that equipment. That's the same reason, you know, we've wanted to do an investigation on that sector specifically. And on the on-road side, ODOT's registration systems only collect, you know, where another state that the vehicle was associated with in certain instances, and we could give you more information on that. So the last type of information we're going to share with you this evening now, I suppose, is information about the ambient concentrations of diesel particulate matter, or the levels of pollution in the air across the state. So the figure on this screen comes from EPA's National Air Toxics Assessment. That's an assessment that estimates ambient concentrations of a wide variety of pollutants down to the census tract level across the country. This map is showing you the degree to which concentrations of diesel particulate matter exceed a 1 in a million cancer risk threshold. And that's a threshold that's been identified as an acceptable level of risk by both the legislature and the Environmental Quality Commission. And determining the cancer risk in a particular area involves two variables: the level of the ambient concentration, the level of pollution that is in the air right there, and then the value, or what we call in Oregon, the ambient benchmark concentration that we associate with a 1 in a million cancer risk. That's something that's also called a toxicity reference value. That's language you all became really familiar with in Cleaner Air Oregon. So as you can see on the map here, cancer risk from diesel particulate matter is highest in the Portland metropolitan area and travels down the I-5 corridor through the Willamette Valley. It's not necessarily surprising given that there's a lot of heavy and light traffic along the I-5 corridor, and you also see construction and manufacturing and other sources tend to cluster around major transportation corridors. Obviously, diesel associated risk doesn't end at the state border. So if we were to kind of turn the other states on, you'd see that risk, move up Washington along the I-5 corridor. And similarly, for example, on the Oregon map, you can see some elevated risk levels in Hermiston. That's probably associated with the Tri-City area, Tri-City and surrounding areas in Washington. So next slide. This is moving now into kind of zeroing in on the Willamette Valley so you can see it in a little finer scale. And again, you can see that larger cities, Portland, Salem, Corvallis, Eugene, all have higher levels of diesel particulate matter based to a large degree on their proximity to I-5 and also just the density and the types of use that comes with a more dense environment. I want to flag here that, this data is averaged at the census tract level. So obviously within a certain census tract, communities experience even higher levels of diesel pollution than what's their corresponding census tract average. So for example, if you live or spend a lot of your time immediately adjacent to a high traffic corridor, that's going to be different than someone who doesn't. And these kind of microenvironment dynamics are masked when you average at a census tract level, particularly when a census tract covers a really large geographic area, as is the case in a lot of the state. So just to kind of illustrate that a little further, next slide, we've included a map from the Portland Air Toxics Solutions project. This was an effort that kind of predates all of your involvement on the commission. It concluded in 2012 and was an effort to forecast levels of air toxics in the Portland region for the year 2017. And as you can see, risk from diesel emission extends throughout the entire region, but is highest in certain parts. And I flagged this because, nationally and in Oregon, environmental justice analyses have demonstrated that lower income people and communities of color are more likely to live in areas with higher concentrations of diesel pollution. And that's related to a variety of issues. And I'd also flagged that from this data, the Multnomah County Health Department did follow-up work that demonstrated that in the study area, census tracts that had at least 15% of the total tract identifying as non-white experience levels of diesel pollution 2 to 3 times those census tracts that are majority white. So again, I'm just underscoring that the risk posed by diesel pollution is distributed disproportionately. It's not distributed equally across the state or even in a microenvironment like Portland. And one additional thing I want to flag here is we talked briefly about that ambient benchmark concentration, that level of pollution that we associate with a 1 in a million excess cancer risk. And in Oregon, that value is 0.1 micrograms per cubic meter. That's the level of the pollution. And neighboring states, including Washington and California, use or recognize toxicity reference values that are much more protective of health, meaning they recognize a 1 in a million cancer risk at a much lower ambient level of diesel particulate matter. And so, for example, if we were to apply California's value of 0.003 micrograms per cubic meter to the map, what we'd see is Oregon communities experiencing levels of diesel particulate matter pollution hundreds of times over the benchmark. And so to be clear in that instance, that it's not the level of pollution that's changing, it's the degree of cancer risk or magnitude of cancer risk that we associate with that same level of pollution. So next slide. So I'm going to try and wrap it up here for us. I won't read through this, but we threw a lot of information kind of at you today and attempted to really summarize the data with some key points here. Again, focused on what we know about diesel emissions in Oregon specifically, both in terms of where they come from and how it plays out in the environment across the state, and also flagging disproportionate impacts. So next slide. I just want to talk briefly, we've already, the conversation has already gone, which is expected, to some of the things we plan to bring back to you in September. So, and we're also flagging this for you because in between now and then, if you have specific policy related questions you really want us to be prepared to talk about, that's really helpful for us to know. And so we're bringing you kind of really useful information in September. So to that end, we'll plan to come to you to talk about what states authority, what authorities states are granted under the Federal Clean Air Act and how that differs from the work of EPA, and also what authorities you have as the Environmental Quality Commission under certain state laws. We're also going to provide for you an inventory of all of the existing programs and policies the state has in place related to addressing diesel engine emissions. And then finally tee up a variety of rulemakings that we expect to be bringing to you over the next 18 months and try and flag some of the key policy questions that are either already surfacing in rulemaking discussions or that we expect to feature in your future conversations. So with that, we're happy to take any additional questions, and again, really appreciate the time.
Well, thank you to our presenters. There really is a lot of information there to absorb, and like Commissioner Kyle, I know I want to spend some more time with it. Do we have any other questions or comments at this time?
I think the only thing that I would bring up is it would be very useful to continue having conversations with Matt and Ollie and Eric and everybody else because of the overlap, or not the overlap, but the previous conversations we had about the area permit, when you have multi-sources, the fact that this isn't an evenly distributed problem across the state. I'd be very curious to know what the state authority is with this, options for that, how to think about incentivizing the renewal of the fleet, because there are policy levers that we can use to address this issue. And we do know that there's communities that are being impacted by this more severely than others, and it is an environmental justice issue. So I'm very curious about this. We did leave the conversation last time with trying to figure out how this report would help us figure out some of those priorities. So I'd very much like to pick back up that conversation in more detail.
And
yes, Vice Chair Barrasso.
Yeah, I just, Matt, I just want to thank you and Eric for this. This is helpful to get this bigger picture, just all the ways in which the diesel pieces come together. And the issue up front. I would love, that data is really, it's interesting, it's just so I go and acknowledge that it's interesting to see that, and I'd love that at some point if there's more, more resolution, like to see that. It's no surprise that logging trucks would, Oregon has a forestry, we have a significant forestry industry here, so it's no surprise that that's more meaningful there, but just where that distribution plays out. Is it fall in one area, or does that actually move across the entire state? If there's any distributional understanding around some of those impacts, that'd just be good to hear, good to see. We saw the map, but I'd love to layer that with some of that moves data that you have. But otherwise, I look forward to the next conversation.
Absolutely, and Vice Chair Barrasso, I would just say on the non-road sector specifically, the agency only recently received the final report from the contractor, and as you see, even in the report that went to you all, it is dense. So I think we, as we continue to kind of dig into it and understand what it's telling us, we're happy to, kind of keep the conversation alive with you all.
Yeah, there definitely is a great deal here, and it's and for somebody like me to whom this information is pretty new, it's going to take a little while to kind of go through it and enhance my understanding of what it is that is available to us right now. Okay, anything else for this last presentation? Okay, not seeing any volunteers at this time. I think I may be safe now to actually call for our recess.
Yes.
And we will get back underway tomorrow morning. We will reconvene at 9 a.m. I want to thank everybody who was with us this afternoon and all the presenters and everybody who joined us on the phone. Thanks very much. And we will see some of you tomorrow at 9 a.m. And until then, the EQC will be in recess. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chair. See you tomorrow.